How does an entire colony disappear without leaving behind a single confirmed answer? England's first permanent attempt to settle North America ended with 90 men, 17 women, and 11 children simply vanishing. When a supply ship finally returned 3 years later, the settlement stood empty. Only one clue remained, carved into a fence post: Croatoan. Historians rarely argue over events with abundant evidence. They argue over the gaps, the missing pages, the damaged inscriptions, the eyewitnesses writing decades too late, the archaeological sites that refuse to tell a single consistent story. Those gaps have produced some of the oldest unanswered questions on Earth. Roanoke is simply where this search begins. A carved word started this one. What else got left behind is next. The fence post still stands, in a sense, in the historical record, if nowhere else. A single wooden marker on a small island off the coast of what is now North Carolina, carved with 9 letters that have outlasted everything and everyone who might have explained them. Beyond it, in 1590, there was nothing. No bodies, no bloodstains, no broken tools scattered across abandoned ground. Just a fort's outline, some heavy items left behind, and silence. This was Roanoke Island, and in the summer of 1587, it became the site of England's first serious attempt to establish a permanent colony in the New World. The expedition was organized under the authority of Sir Walter Raleigh and led by John White, an artist and colonial administrator who brought with him roughly 115 settlers, men, women, and children, including his own daughter, Eleanor Dare, who would give birth shortly after arrival to a girl named Virginia Dare, the first English child known to be born in the Americas. The colony settled on Roanoke Island, within the region the English called Virginia, and almost immediately faced difficulties: strained relations with local indigenous communities, and critical shortages of supplies that could not be resolved from within the colony itself. White made the difficult decision to sail back to England for reinforcements, leaving behind the settlers, including his own daughter and infant granddaughter. He intended to return within months. He did not return for 3 years. England's war with Spain and the resulting demand for every available ship in the Royal Navy delayed his voyage far longer than anyone could have anticipated. When White finally made it back to Roanoke in 1590, he found the settlement dismantled, not destroyed. Its houses taken down in an orderly way, suggesting a deliberate departure rather than a violent raid. The colonists were gone. And carved into a post at the fort's entrance was that single word, Croatoan. A nearby tree bore the letters Crow. White himself believed this indicated the colonists had relocated to Croatoan Island, home to a Native American tribe with whom the English had maintained relatively friendly relations. It had been agreed, before his departure, that if the colonists needed to move, they would carve their destination and add a cross if they had left under distress. No cross was found. By White's own logic, this should have meant reassurance, not mystery. But a storm prevented him from following the trail to Croatoan Island himself, and he returned to England without ever confirming what had actually happened to the settlers, including his own family. He would never see them again. What happened to the roughly 115 men, women, and children of Roanoke has never been definitively resolved. Mainstream historians generally favor a version of White's own theory, that the colonists integrated, at least partially, with local indigenous communities, either on Croatoan Island or elsewhere along the coast, adapting to survive after their English resupply failed to arrive. Scattered, second-hand reports collected by later English explorers describe encounters with indigenous groups exhibiting European features or claiming English ancestry, though none of this evidence has ever been conclusively verified. Other theories point toward conflict with rival indigenous groups, or possibly the Spanish, who maintained a hostile presence elsewhere in the region during this period. More speculative proposals, considerably further from mainstream historical consensus, have suggested everything from disease to a slower, unrecorded migration inland. Archaeological work continues today on Roanoke Island and at sites further inland, occasionally turning up artifacts that suggest possible colonist presence, though nothing has yet offered the kind of definitive confirmation historians are looking for. So the question remains open more than 4 centuries later. Did the lost colony survive, absorbed quietly into a world already there before them? Or does their fate lie somewhere else entirely, still waiting, unmarked, beneath ground no one has yet thought to search? A word we cannot read has already cost us one mystery. Now consider an entire manuscript that refuses to be read at all. Housed today within the climate-controlled vaults of Yale University's Bybliotheca Book and Manuscript Library, catalogued simply as MS-408, sits a book of some 240 vellum pages, bound in soft, unadorned leather. To look at it is to feel, almost immediately, that something is wrong. Not damaged, not decayed, but wrong in a way that's harder to name. The vellum has been carbon dated with reasonable confidence to the early 15th century, sometime between 1404 and 1438. The ink, the binding, the wear patterns on the pages, all of it points to an authentic medieval European origin. This is not a modern forgery, or at least not one assembled from modern materials. And yet no one, in over a century of dedicated study, has ever translated a single confirmed sentence of it. The manuscript is written in a script unlike any other known writing system, roughly 170,000 characters, arranged into what appear to be words, sentences, even paragraphs, flowing left to right with what looks unmistakably like a grammar. Certain characters repeat with the frequency you'd expect from vowels. Word lengths follow patterns consistent with natural language. Statisticians who've run the text through the same tools used to analyze Zipf's law, the mathematical relationship describing how word frequency behaves in real languages, have found the manuscript behaves suspiciously like authentic prose, not random noise. Whatever this is, it does not read like gibberish. It reads like something meant to be understood by someone. Just not, it seems, by us. The illustrations only deepen the puzzle rather than resolving it. Long stretches of the manuscript are devoted to botanical drawings, roots, stems, leaves rendered in careful, confident line work, accompanied by dense blocks of the untranslated script. But here is where the first crack in familiarity appears. Many of these plants correspond to no known species. Some appear to be composites, a root from one plant fused to leaves from another. An entire section depicts what scholars now call balneological imagery, dozens of nude women bathing in interconnected pools, and tubes of green liquid, linked by an intricate plumbing of pipes that resembles, depending on who you ask, either anatomical diagrams or something closer to alchemical apparatus. Further along, a section devoted to astronomy and astrology presents circular diagrams of stars and zodiac symbols, some labeled with tiny handwritten figures whose meaning has never been agreed upon. Provenance offers a few solid footholds, though not many. The earliest confirmed owner we know of is Georg Beresch, a 17th century alchemist in Prague, who wrote to a Jesuit scholar in Rome, the famed polymath Athanasius Kircher, asking for help deciphering a strange book he'd inherited and could make no sense of. The manuscript later passed to Johannes Marcus Marci, who sent it on to Kircher himself in 1666, apparently hoping the era's foremost expert in ancient scripts and cryptography could crack it. Kircher, despite his reputation, appears to have made no headway. The book vanished from clear historical record for over 2 centuries afterward, only resurfacing in 1912 when Polish book dealer Wilfrid Voynich purchased it from a Jesuit college in Italy, giving the manuscript the name it carries today. Mainstream theories have circled the manuscript for a century without landing. Some scholars propose it's an early attempt at a constructed or shorthand language, perhaps a private system devised by a physician or scholar for recording herbal remedies. Others argue it's an elaborate hoax, possibly created by Voynich himself to profit from a mystery, though the carbon dating of the vellum makes a 20th century forgery difficult to sustain, unless someone centuries earlier had already gone to the trouble of hoaxing it first. A 2019 study proposed the text might be an abbreviated form of a known language, possibly medieval Latin shorthand, though the theory has struggled to produce a translation that scholars broadly accept. Codebreakers from both world wars, including some of the same minds who worked at Bletchley Park, attempted the manuscript and came away empty-handed, a detail that alone suggests this is not a simple substitution cipher waiting for a clever enough mind. At the more speculative edges, theories multiply. Some have suggested the manuscript is glossolalia, the product of a mind in an altered or ecstatic state, producing language-like structure without actual meaning. Others, less conventionally, have wondered whether the text encodes something never meant for ordinary readers at all, a hidden system of knowledge, medical, alchemical, or otherwise, deliberately obscured from anyone without the key. None of these theories have supplied that key. What remains is a document that looks, in every measurable way, like it should say something. The grammar is there. The structure is there. The illustrations imply purpose, botanical knowledge, bodily processes, celestial observation, someone's attempt to record what they knew and pass it forward. And yet, 600 years on, across the efforts of cryptographers, linguists, statisticians, and machine learning models trained on every known language and cipher system in human history, the Voynich manuscript has yielded nothing but educated guesses. Perhaps the answer is waiting in a language we haven't thought to try, or a lost dialect no longer spoken anywhere on Earth. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that keeps scholars returning to it, decade after decade, the manuscript was never written to be understood by anyone but its author. A private world sealed inside 240 pages of vellum, waiting for a reader who will never come. A sealed room, waiting for a reader who will never come. That image travels well. Because in the Tower of London, there is another kind of sealed room and another kind of waiting that has haunted English history for over 5 centuries. The tower itself is less a single building than a fortress of accumulated stone, expanded and reinforced over 400 years by the time our story begins, its white tower rising pale and severe above the Thames. By 1483, it served not only as a royal residence and treasury, but as a prison, and it was here in the early summer of that year that 2 boys were brought to stay. One was 12 years old, the other was 9. Edward Thave, the elder, was by rights the King of England, having inherited the throne upon his father Edward IV's sudden death in April of 1483. His younger brother Richard, Duke of York, joined him shortly after, ostensibly for companionship and for safekeeping ahead of Edward's coronation. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had been named Lord Protector, tasked with guiding the young king until he came of age. It was, on paper, a reasonable arrangement. An experienced adult relative shepherding a child monarch through a vulnerable transition. Then the ground shifted. In June of 1483, a clergyman named Robert Stillington came forward with a claim that Edward IV had been secretly pre-contracted to marry another woman before he wed the boy's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, rendering that marriage invalid and the 2 princes illegitimate. Parliament accepted the claim. The boys were declared unfit to inherit the throne, and their uncle, the same man responsible for their protection, was crowned Richard III. The princes remained in the tower. Sometime over the following months, they were seen playing on the grounds less and less. By the end of the summer, contemporary accounts suggest they were not seen at all. What happened to them next is, even now, entirely unknown. The most widely accepted theory, then and now, holds Richard III responsible, that he ordered the boys killed to eliminate any rival claim to the throne he had just secured for himself. This was, notably, the account promoted vigorously under the Tudor dynasty that later deposed Richard at Bosworth Field, and historians have long debated how much of the Tudor narrative reflects genuine investigation versus convenient political propaganda designed to blacken a defeated enemy's name. Sir Thomas More's account, written decades later under Tudor patronage, describes the boys being smothered with pillows and buried beneath a staircase. A vivid, specific story, but one written by a man who was a child himself when the events occurred, drawing on second-hand testimony of uncertain reliability. In 74, workmen renovating the tower discovered a wooden box buried roughly 10 feet beneath a staircase, containing the bones of 2 children. King Charles II, convinced these were the remains of the lost princes, had them interred in Westminster Abbey, where they remain today, sealed within an urn few have been permitted to examine closely since. A limited scientific study in 1933 estimated the ages as roughly consistent with the princes at the time of their disappearance, but the methods available then couldn't confirm identity, sex, or even a confident cause of death, and the bones have not been tested with modern DNA analysis, despite repeated requests from historians. What exactly is the Abbey protecting by declining? Certainty, or the absence of it? Other suspects have been proposed over the centuries, each with a plausible motive. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, Richard's close ally that summer, had his own tenuous claim to royal blood and access to the tower. Some historians argue he may have acted independently, perhaps even without Richard's knowledge, hoping to clear a path toward his own ambitions or curry favor by removing a political liability. Others point toward Henry Tudor, the man who ultimately took the throne as Henry VII, reasoning that he had every bit as much motive as Richard once he'd defeated him, and every incentive afterward to ensure the princes were never found alive to challenge his own legitimacy. And then there are theories that stray further from the documentary record. Some researchers have proposed that one or both boys survived, smuggled out of the tower, and raised in obscurity abroad. This theory gained unexpected traction later in the century, when a young man calling himself Perkin Warbeck appeared in Europe, claiming to be the younger Prince Richard, and gathered enough support to mount a genuine challenge to Henry VII's throne before his eventual capture and execution. Was Warbeck an opportunistic pretender, coached and funded by Richard's enemies? Or did he carry a truth that England's new dynasty had every reason to bury? No confession survives. No contemporary eyewitness account describes the moment of the boys' deaths, if deaths occurred at all. What we have instead is a stone fortress that kept its silence, a dynasty with every incentive to shape the story in its own favor, and 2 sets of small bones resting in an abbey that has never fully opened itself to modern scrutiny. Perhaps one day genetic testing will finally be permitted, and the urn in Westminster Abbey will yield an answer science can stand behind. Until then, the tower keeps its stones exactly where they've always been, patient, unmoved, and entirely unwilling to say what happened within them that summer. Some 4,000 miles east of that English fortress, across a continent and a fractured sea, stood another kind of archive, one that held not the bones of 2 lost princes, but the records of an empire's most ambitious ships. And by the time anyone thought to ask hard questions about them, most of those records were already gone. In the imperial archives of Nanjing, sometime in the 1470s, a fire is said to have taken hold. Though even that detail, the very origin point of this mystery, is contested by historians to this day. What we know with more certainty is that vast portions of the official records documenting the 7 voyages of Zheng He's treasure fleet vanished from the historical record, and that a Ministry of War official named Liu Daxia is widely credited or blamed, with either allowing their destruction or deliberately burning them himself. To understand why anyone would destroy such records, you first have to understand what they described. Between 1405 and 1433, under the Yongle and later Shand emperors, the Ming Dynasty launched a series of naval expeditions unlike anything the world had seen. Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch admiral of extraordinary command, led fleets that dwarfed anything Europe would produce for another century. Some of the largest ships, according to Chinese records, stretched over 400 feet in length, colossal, multi-decked vessels nicknamed treasure ships, crewed by tens of thousands of sailors, soldiers, diplomats, and craftsmen across the full fleet. They sailed as far as the eastern coast of Africa, trading silk and porcelain for ivory, spices, and even, famously, a giraffe presented to the Yongle Emperor as a supposed Qilin, a mythical creature said to appear only during the reign of a virtuous ruler. And then, after the 7th voyage concluded in 1433, the voyages simply stopped. Not gradually, not through some slow decline in ambition or funding. They ended decisively, and the ships that had carried Chinese power across the Indian Ocean were left to rot in harbor or were dismantled outright. Shipbuilding on that scale was banned. Ocean-going vessel construction was restricted, and decades later, when a subsequent official proposed reviving the voyages, Liu Daxia is recorded as having told the emperor that the old fleet records could not be located. Some accounts suggest he admitted to having destroyed them himself, believing the voyages had wasted enormous imperial treasure for little lasting benefit. The mainstream historical explanation is, in many ways, a story about competing priorities within the Ming court. The Confucian bureaucracy that dominated imperial administration had long viewed the voyages with suspicion, seeing them as extravagant vanity projects benefiting the eunuch class, a rival faction within the court, rather than serious instruments of statecraft. Meanwhile, the empire faced mounting threats along its northern border from Mongol forces, threats that demanded resources be redirected toward land-based defense rather than distant maritime ambition. The Grand Canal, recently repaired, offered a cheaper domestic alternative to coastal shipping. Seen this way, the destruction of the records wasn't a mystery so much as bureaucratic housekeeping, an inconvenient chapter quietly closed by officials who preferred it forgotten. But does that fully account for the completeness of the loss? Entire logs, navigational charts, diplomatic correspondence, detailed ship specifications, the kind of documentation any advanced naval power would have treated as invaluable state knowledge, reduced to fragments, second-hand summaries, and a handful of surviving inscriptions on stone tablets erected by Zheng He himself. Why destroy navigational data, of all things, when future rulers might need it regardless of political sentiment toward the eunuch faction? Why erase the technical knowledge along with the political controversy? Some historians have proposed the destruction wasn't merely bureaucratic distaste, but something closer to a deliberate act of ideological correction, an assertion by the Confucian establishment that China's greatness lay inward, in its own civilization, and that the sea itself represented a dangerous, destabilizing distraction from proper governance. Under this reading, the burning wasn't incidental. It was symbolic, a statement about what kind of empire China intended to be going forward. At the more speculative edges of the theory space, Some researchers and popular historians, most notably the controversial 2002 book by Gavin Menzies, have argued the fleets sailed far beyond Africa, reaching the Americas and circumnavigating the globe decades before European explorers, and that the destroyed records may have contained evidence of these voyages that official history preferred erased. Mainstream historians remain broadly skeptical of these claims, citing a lack of corroborating archaeological or textual evidence, though the theory has never entirely faded from public fascination. What remains undisputed is this: China possessed, for a brief window in the early 15th century, the most advanced naval technology and expeditionary capability on Earth, and then, by deliberate human choice, chose to erase both the ships and the records of what they had done and where they had been. Wood rots, paper burns. But the decision to let both disappear, made by men whose full reasoning we can now only reconstruct through fragments and inference, remains its own kind of vanishing. Somewhere, perhaps, further tablets or overlooked provincial archives still wait to be uncovered. A stray inventory, a forgotten diplomatic letter, a fragment that might tell us more about where those ships truly sailed, and why the empire that built them chose so completely to look away from the sea. A century before Liu Daxia's fires took hold in Nanjing, an ocean away on the other side of the world, a stone chamber in the Andean highlands was being filled not with paper, but with gold, and its disappearance would prove just as complete and just as haunting. The city was Cajamarca, high in the Peruvian Andes, and the year was 1532. Francisco Pizarro, at the head of a force of roughly 168 Spanish conquistadors, had marched into the heart of the Inca Empire, an empire that, at its height, commanded some 10 million subjects across a territory stretching along the spine of South America. On November 16th of that year, in the central plaza of Cajamarca, Pizarro's men ambushed the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, slaughtering thousands of his unarmed retinue and taking the emperor himself captive within hours. What followed was one of the strangest ransom negotiations in recorded history. Atahualpa, seeking his freedom, offered to fill a room, roughly 22 feet long and 17 feet wide, with gold as high as he could reach, and to fill a smaller adjoining room twice over with silver. Word went out across the empire, and for months llama trains and porters carried treasure down from temples, palaces, and shrines throughout the Andes. Golden vessels, ornaments, ceremonial objects, sheets of gold stripped from the walls of sacred sites, some pieces representing centuries of accumulated Inca craftsmanship. By some estimates, the ransom ultimately totaled somewhere in the range of 13,000 pounds of gold and nearly twice that in silver, a fortune almost incomprehensible by the standards of the time. Pizarro accepted the ransom, and then, in July of 1533, he had Atahualpa executed anyway, on charges of plotting rebellion that historians have long viewed with deep skepticism. Here is where the mystery begins in earnest, because while a substantial portion of the ransom was melted down, divided among Pizarro's men, and shipped back to Spain, there are persistent historical accounts suggesting that a significant quantity of gold, already en route to Cajamarca when news of Atahualpa's execution reached the carriers, was never delivered at all. According to several colonial-era accounts, the Inca general Rumiñahui, commanding one of these treasure caravans, learned of the emperor's death before reaching the city. Rather than hand the gold to the men who had just murdered his ruler despite an honored bargain, he is said to have ordered the treasure hidden, buried, sunk into a lake, or concealed deep within the mountains, rather than let it reach Spanish hands. The most persistent version of this story centers on Langanats, a brutal, fog-choked mountain range in central Ecuador, where local tradition holds that Rumiñahui's men buried the gold before scattering, taking the secret of its location to their deaths. Is this account historically verifiable? That's harder to say. The story rests primarily on colonial-era testimony and indigenous oral tradition, recorded decades after the events themselves, filtered through Spanish chroniclers with their own motives and blind spots. No definitive Inca-era documentation of the hidden cache has ever surfaced, and the Inca notably did not use a written script in the way European chroniclers did, relying instead on the knotted cord recording system known as quipu, a system modern scholars still cannot fully decode, leaving whatever numerical or administrative details it once held largely inaccessible to us. Nonetheless, the pursuit of Rumenyawi's hidden gold became something of an obsession for treasure hunters across the centuries that followed. In the 1600s, a Spanish captain named Juan de Valverde, according to popular legend, married into an indigenous family and was shown a route to the treasure, later leaving cryptic directions, the so-called Valverde's Guide, that supposedly led toward the site. Expeditions chasing this guide, and others like it, have combed the Langanates Range for over 3 centuries. The terrain itself resists the search: dense cloud forest, near constant rain, treacherous volcanic ground, and a climate so punishing that multiple search parties over the years have vanished or perished attempting to navigate it, lending the region a reputation as cursed in the eyes of some who've attempted the search. Mainstream historians tend to view the Langanates legend with considerable caution, noting that treasure legends often accumulate embellishment with each retelling, and that the geography described in surviving guides is vague enough to fit numerous locations across a vast mountain range. Some researchers argue the hidden treasure may be a conflation of several smaller, more plausible acts of concealment, indigenous communities hiding sacred objects from Spanish looting more broadly, rather than one single, spectacular cache. And yet the core historical facts remain undisputed and strange enough on their own. An emperor paid an almost unimaginable ransom for his life, was killed regardless, and a portion of that ransom, already in motion, seems to have simply stopped moving and vanished from the historical record entirely. No Spanish account definitively closes the gap between the promised total and what was ultimately received and melted down in Cajamarca. Whether Rumenyawi's caravan still rests somewhere within the Langanates Range, swallowed by cloud forest and volcanic stone, or whether the gold was dispersed, reclaimed, or simply never existed in the quantities the legends describe, no expedition in nearly 5 centuries has produced conclusive proof either way. The mountains, for their part, have kept whatever they're holding exactly where it fell. Picture the sound first. Iron battering rams striking stone over and over through the night of May 28th into the early hours of May 29th, 1453, until finally, near dawn, the sound changes. Stone giving way, and then the rising din of tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers pouring through the breach in the Theodosian walls that had held for over 1,000 years and would hold for only a few hours more. By that morning, the city of Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire for over 11 centuries, the last living remnant of Rome itself, belonged to Sultan Mehmed II. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine V, Palaiologos, is said to have torn the imperial insignia from his shoulders and charged into the fighting near the gate of St. Romanus, vanishing into the chaos so completely that his body was never conclusively identified afterward. And with the fall of the city came the disappearance of something almost as significant as the emperor himself: the imperial regalia of Byzantium, the crowns, jewels, and sacred treasures that had adorned Roman and Byzantine emperors for well over 1,000 years. What exactly did this collection contain? Historical and ecclesiastical records, patchy as they are, describe items of extraordinary significance. Among them, reportedly, was a portion of what was believed to be the true cross, along with other relics tied to the early Christian tradition that Byzantine emperors had spent centuries accumulating and displaying as symbols of divine legitimacy. There were crowns set with pearls and precious stones, ceremonial vestments woven with gold thread, and jeweled reliquaries whose exact number and description no single surviving inventory fully accounts for. The Byzantine court had, across its long history, absorbed treasures from Rome itself, along with gifts, tribute, and spoils gathered from across the empire's vast and shifting borders over more than a millennium. When the city fell, that collection scattered, and precisely how and to where remains only partially documented. The mainstream historical account holds that Ottoman forces, following the customs of siege warfare at the time, looted the city extensively in the 3 days Mehmed II permitted his troops following the conquest, as was traditional compensation for a successful siege. Much of the portable wealth of Constantinople, including a considerable portion of the imperial treasury, was seized, melted down, redistributed among soldiers, or absorbed into the Ottoman state's own treasury. Mehmed himself, aware of the historical and symbolic weight of what he'd conquered, is recorded as having intervened personally to preserve certain structures and treasures he considered valuable, including converting the Hagia Sophia into a mosque rather than allowing its destruction. Some scholars argue this selective preservation extended to portions of the imperial regalia as well, folded quietly into Ottoman collections where their Byzantine origins were eventually obscured by time and reclassification. But the full accounting doesn't close cleanly. Several categories of documented treasure simply stop appearing in any records, Ottoman or otherwise, after 1453. Some historians propose that Byzantine nobles and clergy, anticipating the city's fall in the weeks and months before the final siege, smuggled portions of the treasury out by ship, distributing relics and regalia to allied courts, monasteries, and wealthy families across Italy, the Balkans, and beyond, hoping to preserve them, or perhaps to fund a future reconquest that never came. Fragments of this theory find some support in the historical record. Certain relics venerated in European churches today carry provenance claims tracing back to Constantinople's fall, though verifying these claims with certainty, centuries removed from the chaos of the conquest, has proven extraordinarily difficult. Other, more speculative theories propose that portions of the treasure were deliberately hidden within the city itself, perhaps sealed within the extensive network of cisterns and underground passages that honeycomb old Constantinople, structures so extensive that sections of them remain unexplored or unmapped even today. The Basilica cistern alone, a cavernous underground reservoir supported by hundreds of columns, wasn't rediscovered by Western scholars until the 16th century, and local legend held for generations that residents could fish directly through holes in their basement floors into the water below, including, some stories claimed, coins and small treasures lost or hidden in the depths. Whether any portion of the imperial regalia might have been concealed in such spaces, rather than looted or smuggled abroad, remains entirely unproven. But the sheer physical scale of Constantinople's underground architecture leaves the possibility difficult to rule out entirely. What complicates any modern search further is the passage of time itself, and the many hands the city passed through afterward. Ottoman rule for nearly 5 centuries, subsequent modernization, urban development, and the simple erosion of memory that separates any of us from certainty about what happened in a 3-day span nearly 600 years ago. Byzantine records that might have offered clarity were themselves scattered or destroyed in the conquest's aftermath, leaving historians dependent on fragmentary, often contradictory accounts written by outsiders, some sympathetic to the fallen empire, others eager to justify its conquest. Somewhere between the melted-down anonymity of Ottoman treasuries, the quiet reliquaries of European churches, and the dark, unmapped water beneath modern Istanbul's streets, the fate of Byzantium's imperial regalia remains an open question. 1,000 years of accumulated history, sealed inside gold and stone, walked into the chaos of a single fallen night. And no one since has been able to say, with any real confidence, where all of it went, where one empire's treasure vanished into cisterns and melted anonymity. Another empire's ambitions would soon send a different fortune to the bottom of the sea entirely, carried, this time, aboard the flagship of the very man who helped build Portugal's Eastern Empire in the first place. His name was Afonso de Albuquerque, and by 1511 he was perhaps the most feared and effective naval commander in the Indian Ocean. Under his command, Portugal had seized Goa, secured a foothold at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, and now set its sights on Malacca, the wealthy trading port controlling the strait between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, a choke point so valuable that whoever held it effectively controlled the flow of spices, silk, and treasure moving between east and west. Albuquerque took Malacca in August of 1511, and in doing so inherited not just a city, but its accumulated wealth. Malacca's sultanate had grown fabulously rich as a trading hub, and among the spoils Albuquerque claimed was said to be treasure gathered from the deposed Sultan of Malacca himself, intended as a gift for King Manuel I of Portugal, an offering meant to demonstrate, in the most tangible terms possible, the value of Portugal's new eastern conquests. The full contents of that treasure are described, though not always consistently, across surviving Portuguese accounts. Gold and jewels are mentioned, along with ornate furnishings looted from Malacca's royal court. Some accounts describe a golden statue, life-sized, representing a Malay princess, along with other ceremonial objects of considerable value. Modern estimates of the treasure's worth vary enormously depending on which historical sources are weighted most heavily, ranging from significant to, by some claims, almost incalculable. Figures that should probably be treated with the same caution historians apply to most treasure legends inflated by centuries of retelling. The ship chosen to carry this treasure home was the Flor de la Mar, the Flower of the Sea, a Portuguese carrack that had already served nearly a decade in Indian Ocean waters by the time it was loaded for the return voyage. And this is where the mainstream historical record and the mystery begin to overlap directly, because the Flor de la Mar was, by multiple contemporary accounts, in poor condition. The ship had suffered damage over its years of service, its hull weakened, and several of Albuquerque's own officers reportedly advised against using it for such a valuable cargo, arguing it was no longer seaworthy enough for the journey. Albuquerque used it anyway. In November of 1511, the Flor de la Mar, along with several other vessels in the fleet, encountered a violent storm off the coast of Sumatra, near the Strait of Malacca. The ship broke apart. Albuquerque himself survived, reportedly clinging to wreckage or escaping aboard a smaller vessel, but the Flor de la Mar and its cargo went down, and with it, by most accounts, the entirety of the treasure intended for King Manuel. This much is documented with reasonable historical confidence. What follows is where certainty begins to dissolve. The wreck's exact location has never been conclusively identified. The waters off Sumatra in that region are notoriously difficult to search. Shifting sandbars, strong currents, and centuries of coastal change have altered the seafloor considerably since 1511, and the coastline itself has shifted in ways that complicate any attempt to correlate historical accounts with modern geography. Indonesian and Malaysian waters in the search area also carry significant legal and jurisdictional complexity, further complicating serious archaeological efforts. Since the late 20th century, multiple treasure hunting expeditions, some backed by private investors hoping for a spectacular payout, have claimed to have located promising wreck sites, though none of these claims has been definitively authenticated by independent marine archaeologists, and disputes over salvage rights, government permits, and the reliability of the searchers themselves have repeatedly stalled serious investigation. Skeptics within the historical community raise a further question worth sitting with. How much of the treasure's legendary value reflects genuine 16th century inventory, and how much reflects centuries of embellishment, the kind that tends to accumulate around any lost fortune left unrecovered long enough for imagination to fill the gaps left by documentation? Portuguese colonial record-keeping, thorough in some respects, was not immune to exaggeration, particularly when describing conquests meant to justify continued royal investment in expensive, dangerous overseas campaigns. And yet the core facts remain remarkable enough without embellishment. A ship carrying the accumulated wealth of a fallen sultanate, warned against sailing, sent out regardless, and lost within months to a storm in waters that, 5 centuries later, still refuse to give up their secret with any certainty. Somewhere along the seafloor near the Strait of Malacca, wood long since dissolved by time and current, whatever remains of the Flor de la Mar's cargo waits, still uncatalogued, still unclaimed by history. Every so often, a new expedition sets out, equipped with sonar and confidence that this time the search will finally end. So far, the strait has kept its answer to itself. Consider for a moment how many of these mysteries end not with a dramatic single event, but with silence, a fire, a storm, a vanished caravan, and then simply nothing further written down. Greenland offers us perhaps the purest version of that silence yet, an entire European colony that appears to have wound down not in a moment, but slowly, and no one recorded the ending at all. The Norse settlements of Greenland were founded around 985 AD, when Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland, led a small fleet of settlers to the island's southwestern coast, establishing what became known as the Eastern and Western settlements. At its height, the Norse Greenlandic population is estimated to have reached somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people, spread across roughly 400 farms, complete with churches, a cathedral at Gardar, livestock, and trade connections stretching back to Norway and, through it, the rest of medieval Europe. For nearly 500 years, these settlements persisted on the edge of the habitable world, farming a landscape that demanded constant, punishing effort simply to survive. And then, sometime in the 15th century, they stopped existing. The Western settlement's last archaeological and documentary traces date to around the mid-1300s. The Eastern settlement, the larger and longer-lasting of the two, appears to have persisted later, with the final confirmed written record being a 1408 account of a wedding held at Hävalsi Church, a stone structure that still stands today, roof gone but walls remarkably intact, on a quiet fjord in southern Greenland. After that, nothing. No further letters, no trade ships returning with news, no final report of abandonment, catastrophe, or departure. Just an absence that historians didn't fully register as permanent until much later, when subsequent expeditions arrived to find the settlements empty. What could account for an entire colony's disappearance without a single surviving account of how it happened? The most widely supported explanation among historians and archaeologists centers on a convergence of pressures, rather than any single dramatic cause. Climate data drawn from ice cores and sediment analysis confirms that the region entered a colder period, part of what's broadly termed the Little Ice Age, beginning in the 14th century, shortening growing seasons, increasing sea ice that would have hampered both farming and the ships that connected Greenland to Europe, and placing mounting strain on a population already living at the edge of agricultural viability. Trade with Norway, the settlement's economic lifeline, is documented to have declined significantly during this same period, partly due to the Black Death's devastating impact on Norwegian and broader European populations and shipping capacity beginning in 1349. Isotopic analysis of Norse Greenlandic skeletal remains shows a documented dietary shift over time, with increasing reliance on marine resources, suggesting a population adapting, perhaps not successfully enough, to failing terrestrial food sources. This slow pressure theory is compelling, well supported by physical evidence, and almost certainly captures real aspects of what happened, but it leaves specific, harder questions only partially answered. Archaeological excavations of some final phase farms show valuable items, including iron tools and, in certain cases, church bells, left behind rather than taken, a detail that has puzzled researchers, since departing settlers evacuating in an orderly fashion would presumably have carried genuinely valuable metal goods with them rather than abandoning them on site. Some sites show signs of what appears to be a rushed or incomplete departure, while others suggest gradual attrition, farm by farm, over an extended period, rather than one final synchronized exodus. Relations with the indigenous Thule people, ancestors of modern Greenlandic Inuit, who were expanding southward into Norse territory during this same period, have also drawn scholarly attention, though the nature of that contact, trade, conflict, both, or largely separate coexistence, remains debated, with archaeological evidence offering only fragmentary and sometimes contradictory signals about how frequent or hostile such encounters actually were. More speculative theories have proposed additional catalysts. A possible pirate raid recorded in a single 15th century account describing an attack on Greenland by an unnamed group, sometimes suggested to be English or Basque vessels operating in North Atlantic waters. The possibility that surviving settlers didn't perish, but instead assimilated into Thule communities, or attempted to relocate elsewhere entirely, perhaps toward Vinland or unrecorded coastal sites, leaving no trace precisely because their departure succeeded rather than failed. None of these theories currently commands the kind of broad evidentiary support that the climate and trade explanation does, but none has been definitively ruled out either. What remains across the fjords of southern Greenland are stone foundations, a roofless church at Valsey still standing after 6 centuries, and scattered farms whose final residents left behind just enough to prove they were once there, and not nearly enough to explain how or exactly when they stopped being there at all. Perhaps future excavation or further advances in isotopic and genetic analysis of the remains still being recovered from Greenland's slowly thawing permafrost will narrow the story further. For now, the silence that followed 1408 remains one of medieval history's quietest disappearances. Not a single catastrophic ending, but hundreds of small, unrecorded ones, scattered across a landscape that simply stopped answering. Stone foundations, empty and unclaimed. That's where we left Greenland. Now, picture a different kind of empty case. A glass display in Vienna's Welt Museum, climate-controlled, dimly lit, holding a headdress of nearly 400 iridescent Quetzal feathers, arranged in a radiating fan nearly 4 feet across, backed with a gold ornamentation and lined in leather already centuries old by the time European scholars first began seriously cataloging it. This object is known today as the penacho, believed by many to be a ceremonial headdress connected to Montezuma II, the 9th Tlatoani, or ruler of the Aztec Empire. Whether it was ever actually worn by Montezuma himself, gifted by him to Hernan Cortés, or crafted for an entirely different ceremonial purpose remains, even now, a matter of genuine scholarly dispute. But the headdress is in many ways only a fragment of a much larger absence, because the crown most closely associated with Moctezuma's actual royal authority, the object Spanish chroniclers described adorning the emperor during his reign, has never been definitively located at all. Moctezuma II ruled the Aztec Empire at its territorial and cultural height, commanding the great city of Tenochtitlan. a metropolis built on an island in Lake Texcoco that stunned the first Spanish soldiers to see it, with causeways, canals, and a central temple complex rising above a population historians estimate may have exceeded 200,000 people. When Cortés arrived in 1519, Montezuma received the Spanish with a combination of caution, diplomacy, and, according to varying historical accounts, considerable gift-giving, including gold, textiles, and ceremonial objects meant to demonstrate the wealth and legitimacy of his rule. Spanish chroniclers, including Bernal Díaz del Castillo, who accompanied Cortés, and later wrote one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of the conquest, describe Moctezuma's regalia in some detail: headdresses, jewelry, and specifically a crown-like ornament associated with his royal office. But descriptions across various Spanish sources don't agree cleanly on the crown's exact form, material, or ultimate fate, leaving modern historians to reconstruct its likely appearance from fragments rather than a single authoritative account. What happened during the Spanish conquest itself only deepens the confusion around any single royal object's fate. Following Moctezuma's death in 1520, under circumstances still debated by historians, Spanish accounts claim he was killed by his own people during an uprising, while some indigenous sources suggest Spanish forces killed him directly. The Aztec capital fell into open warfare. The Spanish were driven from Tenochtitlan during what became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, in which many conquistadors, weighed down by looted gold and treasure they refused to abandon even as they fled, drowned attempting to cross the causeways under attack. An enormous quantity of Aztec treasure, potentially including royal regalia, is documented to have been lost in the lake that night, some of it never recovered by either side. When Tenochtitlan finally fell to a renewed Spanish assault in 1521, the city was largely destroyed, and whatever treasury and ceremonial objects remained within it were seized, melted down, or scattered among conquering forces, following patterns historians would later see repeated in other conquered American empires. Official Spanish inventories from the period, while documenting substantial gold shipments back to Spain, are notably inconsistent and incomplete regarding specific ceremonial items, making it exceptionally difficult to trace any single object, including a crown specifically identified as Moctezuma's, from Tenochtitlan's fall to a confirmed final resting place. The penacho itself entered the historical record in Europe by the mid-16th century, appearing in the inventory of an Austrian archduke, though exactly how it traveled from Mexico to the Habsburg collections remains only partially documented, with several plausible routes proposed but none definitively confirmed. Mexican historians and cultural institutions have long argued the headdress should be considered a crown in function, if not in traditional European form, and have periodically requested its return from Austria, a request that raises its own difficult questions about what, precisely, this surviving object represents, and whether it constitutes the crown, a crown, or simply one ceremonial item among many now lost. Other theories, less documented but persistent within both academic and popular circles, suggest that additional royal regalia, including objects more clearly identifiable as Moctezuma's personal crown, may have been deliberately hidden by Aztec nobility during the chaos of the Spanish siege, buried within Tenochtitlan itself, or smuggled beyond the valley before the city's final collapse. Modern excavations beneath Mexico City, built directly atop the ruins of Tenochtitlan, continue to uncover Aztec offerings and ceremonial caches with some regularity, including the extraordinary ongoing discoveries at the Templo Mayor site, raising the tantalizing possibility that further ceremonial objects, perhaps even royal ones, remain buried beneath the modern city's foundations, still unexcavated. Whether Moctezuma's crown survived the conquest at all, whether it lies preserved in an uncatalogued European collection, or whether it remains buried somewhere beneath the streets of modern Mexico City, no historian has yet been able to say with confidence. What we're left with, for now, is a single feathered headdress under glass in Vienna, and a much larger question about everything else that vanished alongside it. From the sunken causeways of Lake Texcoco, travel now across an ocean and back several decades earlier, to a hilltop palace above the Danube, where a different kind of treasure was being assembled. Not in gold, but in ink, vellum, and gold-leafed binding. The city was Buda, capital of the Kingdom of Hungary, and the man was King Matthias Corvinus, who ruled from 1458 to 1490. Matthias was, by the standards of his age, an unusually learned monarch, deeply invested in the humanist scholarship spreading through Renaissance Italy, and determined to build a royal library that could rival, or surpass, the great collections of Florence and Rome. What he assembled came to be known as the Bibliotheca Corviniana, and by the time of his death, it's estimated to have contained somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 codices, an extraordinary figure for the period, rivaled at the time only by the Vatican Library itself. To understand what made this collection remarkable, you have to understand the labor behind it. Matthias employed scribes, illuminators, and bookbinders, both in Buda and in Florence, commissioning elaborately decorated manuscripts on classical philosophy, history, astronomy, medicine, and theology, many copied from ancient Greek and Latin texts that were themselves rare or endangered. The surviving Corvinas, as these manuscripts are now called, are renowned for their exceptional artistry, bound in colored leather, often red or brown, stamped with gold, and opening onto illuminated pages featuring intricate borders, portraits, and Matthias's personal emblem, a raven, from which his name Corvinus was derived. Contemporary visitors to the Buda Palace described a library hall of considerable grandeur, and scholars across Europe corresponded with Matthias's court, eager for access to texts otherwise unavailable north of the Alps. Then Matthias died suddenly in 1490, with no legitimate heir formally recognized to the throne, and the fate of his kingdom and his library began to unravel almost immediately. What we know with reasonable historical confidence is this: the library was neglected under Matthias's weaker successors, who lacked both his scholarly interest and, increasingly, the financial resources to maintain such a costly collection. Hungary's political situation deteriorated across the following decades, culminating in catastrophe at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, when Ottoman forces under Suleiman the Magnificent crushed the Hungarian army and killed the reigning king, Louis II. Buda itself fell to Ottoman occupation shortly afterward, and it's from this period that the library's documented history becomes fragmented, contradictory, and, in places, almost entirely silent. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts describe significant losses during this period. Some manuscripts are recorded as having been looted by occupying forces, others reportedly damaged or destroyed amid the general chaos of military occupation, and still others said to have been given away, sold, or dispersed by Hungarian nobility desperate for funds or favor during a period of sustained political collapse. By the time Ottoman forces were finally driven from Buda in 1686, after over a century and a half of occupation, the library that once held thousands of volumes had been reduced to a small fraction of its original size. Of the estimated 2,000 to 2,500 codices Matthias once possessed, only around 216 are known to survive today, scattered across roughly 45 institutions and private collections in more than a dozen countries, including the National Széchenyi Library in Budapest, the Austrian National Library in Vienna, the Vatican Library, and university collections as far afield as the United States. This much is well documented, if genuinely tragic. But here the mystery deepens beyond simple wartime loss, because the surviving accounts of the library's destruction don't fully agree with one another, and several persistent gaps remain unexplained by the standard narrative of Ottoman conquest and neglect. For one, some historical accounts suggest that Suleiman the Magnellant himself, upon taking Buda, was sufficiently impressed by the library's scholarly value that he ordered a portion of the collection preserved and transported to Constantinople rather than destroyed. A detail that, if accurate, would mean a meaningful share of Matthias's library survived the conquest intact, at least initially, only to disappear more quietly within Ottoman archives over subsequent centuries, rather than being lost in a single violent moment. If true, this raises an obvious question that scholars have pursued for generations without full resolution. Did portions of the Corviniana remain within Ottoman, and later Turkish, collections long after the fall of Buda, uncatalogued or unrecognized among the vast holdings of the Topkapi Palace or other Ottoman-era archives? Periodic diplomatic gestures over the centuries, including several manuscripts returned to Hungary by Turkish authorities as goodwill gestures in the 19th and 20th centuries, lend some credibility to the idea that additional volumes may still exist within Turkish institutional collections, not yet identified as Corvinian in origin. Other theories point toward simple, unglamorous dispersal, the idea that many manuscripts were sold individually over decades, absorbed quietly into private European libraries by collectors who had no particular interest in or knowledge of their royal Hungarian origin, and whose descendants, generations later, might possess a Corvina without any awareness of what they hold. Manuscript scholars occasionally do report new discoveries even now. Individual volumes surfacing in private or lesser-known institutional collections and subsequently authenticated as part of Matthias's original library, suggesting the total count of surviving Corvinas, while unlikely to grow dramatically, may not yet be entirely fixed. At the more speculative edges of the discussion, some researchers have wondered whether a more substantial cache of manuscripts might still exist somewhere intact, hidden or forgotten during the chaos of the 16th century, rather than destroyed. Perhaps within a monastery, a noble estate, or an archive that has simply never been thoroughly searched for Corvinian material. No credible evidence currently supports the existence of such a hidden cache, and most manuscript historians consider individual, gradual dispersal the far more likely explanation for where the missing volumes went. But the sheer scale of the loss, roughly 90% of an entire royal library reduced to scattered fragments across a dozen countries, leaves the door, however narrowly, open to speculation. What remains certain is this. For a brief, remarkable period in the 15th century, Buda held one of Europe's great intellectual treasures, assembled by a king who believed knowledge itself was worth the extraordinary expense of preserving it. And then, across a century and a half of war and occupation, that collection dissolved into fragments scattered across a continent, leaving behind 216 known survivors, a raven emblem stamped in gold, and the quiet, persistent possibility that somewhere, uncatalogued and unrecognized, more of Matthias Corvinus's library is still waiting to be found. A small rented room in Deptford, just outside London, late afternoon, May 30th, 1593. The sound of raised voices, a dispute apparently over the bill, who owed what for a day spent eating, drinking, and talking behind closed doors. And then, according to the official account, a silence, broken by a single, decisive stroke of a dagger. The room belonged to Eleanor Bull, a widow who kept a lodging house in Deptford, and the man who died there that evening was Christopher Marlowe, playwright, poet, and by 1593, one of the most celebrated dramatists in England, author of Dr. Faustus, Tamburlaine, and the Jew of Malta, plays that had helped define the Elizabethan stage before William Shakespeare's own reputation had fully taken shape. Marlowe was 29 years old. The official account recorded by the coroner William Danby just 2 days after the death describes a dispute over the reckoning, the bill for food and drink shared that day among 4 men: Marlowe himself and 3 others, Ingram Fraser, Nicholas Skeers, and Robert Poley. According to the inquest, Fraser and Marlowe argued over who owed what. The argument escalated. Marlowe seized Fraser's dagger from behind and struck him twice on the head, and Fraser, trapped between the other 2 men on a bench, wrestled the dagger back and stabbed Marlowe once above the right eye, killing him instantly. A jury returned a verdict of self-defense within days. Fraser received a royal pardon shortly afterward and returned to his life without further consequence. Marlowe was buried in an unmarked grave at St. Nicholas's Church in Deptford. On its surface, this reads like a straightforward, if tragic, account of a tavern dispute gone wrong. And for centuries, that's largely how it was recorded and accepted. But the deeper you look into who these men actually were, the less that surface account seems to hold together on its own. Because none of the 3 men in that room with Marlowe were ordinary tavern companions. All 3, historical research over the past century has established, had documented connections to the Elizabethan intelligence apparatus, the sprawling and secretive espionage network built primarily under Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's principal secretary and spymaster. Robert Poley was a known government agent with a long history of intelligence work, having previously infiltrated conspiracies against the Crown, including involvement in exposing the Babington plot against Elizabeth III. Nicholas Skeers had documented ties to intelligence operations and had previously worked alongside Poley on other matters connected to state surveillance. Ingram Fraser, meanwhile, worked as a servant and business agent to Thomas Walsingham, a cousin of the late Francis Walsingham and himself a patron with continued connections to the intelligence world Marlowe had, by several accounts, been drawn into himself. And Marlowe's own relationship to that world adds another layer entirely. Historical records, including university documents from Cambridge, indicate Marlowe had, at some point during his studies, undertaken work on behalf of the Crown significant enough that the Privy Council itself intervened to ensure he received his degree, despite unexplained absences from campus. Records suggesting service to the state important enough to override ordinary academic requirements. Exactly what that service entailed has never been definitively established, though scholars have proposed everything from courier work to more direct intelligence gathering connected to English Catholic exile communities on the continent, communities Elizabethan intelligence closely monitored for plots against the Protestant crown. Then there's the matter of what happened in the days immediately before Marlowe's death. Just 12 days earlier, on May 18th, the Privy Council had issued a warrant for Marlowe's arrest, connected to accusations of atheism and heretical writings that had surfaced through Thomas Kidd, a fellow playwright who, under torture, produced documents allegedly belonging to Marlowe, containing heretical religious content. Marlowe was summoned before the Privy Council, questioned, and then released under an obligation to report daily, rather than being immediately imprisoned, an unusually lenient arrangement for accusations that, at the time, could carry severe punishment. He was, in effect, out on a kind of informal bail, awaiting further proceedings, when he spent that final day in Deptford. Why was Marlowe treated with such leniency for an accusation as serious as heresy? Was his continued freedom connected to ongoing intelligence work? Perhaps something the Crown still needed from him? And why, of all people, would he spend what may have been among his final free days in the company of 3 men so deeply embedded in the state's surveillance apparatus? The mainstream historical position, held by many Marlowe scholars, is that the killing likely was connected to his intelligence work in some fashion, though not necessarily through deliberate assassination. Perhaps a falling out over money owed for espionage-related expenses, or tension surfacing from work whose details we can no longer reconstruct with confidence, resulting in a genuinely spontaneous, if suspicious, act of violence. This reading takes the coroner's account largely at face value, while acknowledging the surrounding context makes a simple bar fight an incomplete explanation on its own. More speculative theories go considerably further. Some researchers have proposed that Marlowe's death was a deliberate assassination, ordered by figures within the government eager to silence him, either over the heresy accusations, which may have threatened to implicate powerful patrons, or over secrets from his intelligence work that made him a liability. A smaller, more unconventional theory, championed by a handful of researchers over the past century, suggests that Marlowe didn't die in Deptford at all, that the death was staged with the help of his intelligence connections to allow him to escape prosecution, and that he continued writing afterward under a different name, a theory occasionally and controversially connected to authorship debates surrounding Shakespeare's own plays. This theory finds little support among mainstream historians and literary scholars, who point to the specific witnessed inquest and burial record as strong evidence against it, but it has persisted in popular discussion nonetheless. What remains, 5 centuries later, is a coroner's report that resolved the case within days, 3 witnesses with intelligence ties too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, and a young playwright who died in a rented room under circumstances that official record closed almost as quickly as it opened them, leaving historians ever since to wonder whether we've been handed the truth of that afternoon in Deptford, or simply the version someone wanted written down. 20 years before that dagger fell in Deptford, and an ocean away from England's court intrigue, a different kind of document was being assembled. One that would sit forgotten for nearly 4 centuries before anyone thought to ask how, exactly, its maker knew what he seemed to know. The document is a fragment of gazelle skin parchment, roughly 90 by 63 centimeters, housed today in the Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul. It survives as only about a third of what was once, by its own creator's account, a considerably larger world map. Its maker was Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral, cartographer, and nephew of the famed corsair Kemal Reis, who compiled the map in 1513 and later presented it to Sultan Selim III. The map vanished from historical attention for centuries, rediscovered only in 1929 during a cataloging effort at Topkapi Palace, at which point scholars began examining it closely for the first time in the modern era, and found something that didn't entirely add up. What the surviving fragment depicts is in itself historically significant enough. It shows the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and portions of the Caribbean, rendered with a level of detail and relative accuracy that reflects, according to Piri Reis's own marginal notes, a synthesis of roughly 20 older source maps, including, by his account, a map that had belonged to Christopher Columbus himself, along with Portuguese, Arab, and other European charts circulating in the eastern Mediterranean during this period of intense Ottoman naval activity and intelligence gathering. Piri Reis was explicit about his methodology, noting in the map's margins that he had compiled and cross-referenced multiple sources rather than working from direct exploration, a completely reasonable practice for a cartographer of his era, working within one of the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering naval powers in the world. The mainstream historical explanation for the map's overall accuracy is, in this light, fairly straightforward. Piri Reis had access, through Ottoman naval intelligence, and captured or acquired European charts, to some of the most current cartographic knowledge available anywhere in the world during the early 16th century. shortly after Columbus's voyages had begun reshaping European understanding of Atlantic geography. Given his stated sources and the historical reality of extensive Mediterranean intelligence networks, trading captured maps, and navigational data, the map's competent depiction of the Atlantic coastlines known to Europeans by 1513 requires no explanation beyond skilled compilation work. Where the genuine scholarly debate begins is further south, in the portion of the map some researchers have interpreted as depicting the coastline of Antarctica. Here's where care and language matters enormously. The lower portion of the surviving map fragment shows a landmass extending along the bottom edge, which Piri Reis's own notes describe as the coast of South America continuing southward, consistent with period beliefs about a great southern landmass that many contemporary cartographers, following classical and medieval geographic theory, believed must exist to balance the landmasses of the northern hemisphere. Some researchers, beginning most prominently with Captain Arlington Mallory in the 1950s, and later popularized by Charles Hapgood in his 1966 book Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, have argued that this southern coastline bears a resemblance to the actual subglacial topography of Antarctica's Queen Maud Land coast, a coastline that, if the comparison holds, would not be accurately mapped by modern science until ice-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 20th century, since the actual coastline lies buried beneath thousands of feet of ice. This claim, it's worth being clear, sits well outside mainstream cartographic and historical scholarship. The majority of geographers and historians who have studied the map professionally argue the southern landmass is better explained as a somewhat distorted, theoretically driven extension of the South American coastline, reflecting period cartographic conventions and guesswork rather than genuine knowledge of Antarctic geography. A continent that mainstream history holds was not discovered by any civilization until Russian, British, and American expeditions in 1820. Critics of the Antarctica interpretation point out that matching ambiguous historical coastlines to modern geography is a notoriously unreliable exercise, prone to pattern seeking that can make old, imprecise maps appear to match almost any coastline a researcher is determined to find. And yet the theory has persisted for decades, in part because it taps into a genuinely unresolved larger question that extends well beyond this single map. How much of ancient and medieval cartographic knowledge derived from source material that no longer survives for us to examine directly? Piri Reis himself tells us he worked from roughly 20 source maps, several centuries old even in his own time, virtually none of which have survived to the present day for scholars to verify against his finished compilation. What did those lost source maps actually contain? How far back did the chain of copied, recopied, and synthesized geographic knowledge extend, and through how many hands before reaching Piri Reis's workshop in 1513? This is, in some sense, the quieter and more defensible mystery underlying the more sensational Antarctica claims. Not that the map proves contact with a lost or ancient advanced civilization, a claim virtually no credentialed historian or cartographer accepts, but that it stands as physical evidence of an enormous, largely undocumented network of geographic knowledge, exchanged and compiled across Mediterranean, Arab, and European sources over centuries, the vast majority of which has simply been lost to time, fire, and neglect, leaving us only this one surviving fragment as proof such a network existed at all. What remains in that climate-controlled room in Topkapi Palace is two-thirds of a mystery by the map's own admission, since even Piri Reis tells us directly that a larger, more complete document once existed and no longer does. Whatever those missing sections depicted, and whatever additional source maps informed them, sits beyond recovery now, leaving scholars to debate not just what the surviving fragment shows, but how much more accurate, ordinary, or genuinely strange the missing two-thirds might once have been. Lost source material, copied and recopied until the originals vanish entirely. It's a problem that didn't end with Piri Reis's 20 missing charts. It found perhaps its most tantalizing expression 80 years later, in the private notebooks of a man who wrote in mirror script and, by his own admission, never finished cataloging what was in his own head. Leonardo da Vinci died in 1519 at Clos-Lucé in France, leaving behind an estimated 13,000 to 14,000 pages of notes, sketches, and technical drawings, composed across roughly 4 decades of restless, wide-ranging inquiry into anatomy, engineering, hydraulics, optics, botany, and painting. These pages, known collectively today as his Codices, survive now scattered across at least 8 major collections worldwide, from the Codex Atlanticus in Milan's Bibliotheca Ambrosiana to the Codex Leicester, privately owned since 1994 by Bill Gates, to smaller collections held in Paris, Madrid, London, and Turin. And here is the detail that anchors this particular mystery in verifiable fact rather than speculation. Those 13,000 to 14,000 surviving pages are themselves widely believed by Leonardo scholars to represent only a fraction, perhaps as little as a quarter to a half, of what Leonardo actually produced across his lifetime. Leonardo's notebooks were, by design, deeply personal working documents, written predominantly in his famous mirror script, right to left, legible only when held up to a reflective surface, a habit scholars generally attribute to his natural left-handedness rather than any deliberate attempt at encryption, though the effect certainly renders the pages inaccessible to a casual reader regardless of the original intent. The pages themselves are a chaotic, non-linear sprawl by design, mixing anatomical studies with grocery lists, engineering sketches with philosophical musings, war machine designs beside studies of water flow and bird flight, organized by nothing more consistent than what happened to occupy Leonardo's restless attention on a given day. What happened to these notebooks after Leonardo's death is where the documented history becomes considerably murkier. He left the bulk of his papers to his student and companion, Francesco Melzi, who maintained the collection with apparent care for decades, attempting, without ever completing the task, to organize the material into a coherent treatise on painting. After Melzi's own death around 1570, however, the notebooks passed to his son, Orazio, who had little of his father's scholarly interest in preserving them intact. Historical accounts describe the collection being broken apart during this period, with individual pages and bound sections sold, given away, or simply dispersed among various collectors, some of whom, according to surviving records, physically cut apart bound notebooks to sell individual pages or drawings separately, a practice that would have been considered acceptable art market behavior at the time, but that modern scholars regard as a genuine historical catastrophe, permanently severing pages from whatever original context and sequence Leonardo had intended. This dispersal accounts for much of the gap between what Leonardo likely produced and what survives today, and most Leonardo scholars regard simple loss through fire, water damage, neglect, and the ordinary attrition of 5 intervening centuries as the primary explanation for the missing material. Paper doesn't survive well across 500 years without careful, continuous preservation, and the notebooks changed hands among numerous owners of varying diligence throughout that time. But certain more specific losses have drawn particular scholarly attention, precisely because contemporary sources describe their contents in enough detail to make their disappearance feel less like ordinary attrition and more like a distinct, documented void. Leonardo's contemporary and biographer Giorgio Vasari, along with other period sources, references treatises Leonardo was known to be actively working on, including a comprehensive planned work on human anatomy, based on his documented dissections of some 30 human cadavers, conducted with a rigor and detail that, had the full treatise survived intact and been published in his lifetime, might have significantly advanced European anatomical science by a matter of decades, predating Andreas Vesalius's landmark anatomical publications. Fragments of this anatomical work do survive, remarkable in their detail and accuracy, but scholars agree the surviving pages represent only a portion of what Leonardo's own notes indicate he completed. Similarly, Leonardo's notebooks contain repeated references to a planned treatise on the flight of birds and mechanical flying devices, portions of which survive in the Codex on the flight of birds housed in Turin, but which his own writings suggest was intended to be considerably more comprehensive than the surviving fragment reflects. Whether these more complete, referenced but missing treatises were ever actually finished in polished form, or existed only as Leonardo's characteristically unfinished ambitions, scattered across notes he never assembled into the coherent works he described, remains genuinely unclear, and probably unknowable without the missing pages themselves surfacing somewhere. Beyond ordinary historical attrition, more specific theories have occasionally circulated regarding particular missing material. Some researchers have proposed that certain notebooks or sections, particularly those touching on military engineering designs Leonardo produced while working for various Italian patrons including Cesare Borgia, may have been deliberately suppressed or kept from wider circulation during his lifetime or shortly after, given their potential military value to rival states. This remains speculative, without strong documentary support, though it reflects a broader pattern worth noting. Leonardo did, at points in his career, work under patrons with clear strategic interest in controlling access to his more sensitive technical designs. Occasionally, previously unknown Leonardo pages do resurface, authenticated by paper analysis, ink composition, and handwriting comparison against the established body of his work. A reminder that the boundary of surviving versus lost isn't necessarily fixed. A drawing identified in 2005, and further Leonardo attributed pages surfacing periodically in private collections and archives since, suggest that some portion of the estimated missing material may not be destroyed at all, but simply unrecognized, sitting uncatalogued in a private collection or provincial archive somewhere in Europe, its significance unnoticed by whoever currently possesses it. What remains certain is only the shape of the absence itself. Thousands of pages, by Leonardo's own scattered references to work he considered complete or nearly so, that no longer exist anywhere scholars have been able to locate, alongside the persistent, quiet possibility that somewhere, in an attic or a forgotten archive, a portion of what one of history's most restless minds actually finished is still waiting, mirror script and all, for someone to hold the page up to the light. Leonardo was 6 years old, growing up in the hills outside Florence, when a 19-year-old peasant girl from Lorraine was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. And centuries later, both figures would leave behind a body of surviving material haunted by the same nagging question: what happened to everything that didn't make it into the historical record? Jeanne d'Arc, known to history as Joan of Arc, was captured by Burgundian forces in May of 1429, sold to their English allies, and tried before an ecclesiastical court on charges of heresy in the city of Rouen. On May 30th, 1431, she was burned at the stake in the city's Old Market Square, a public execution witnessed by a substantial crowd and documented in considerable detail by contemporary chroniclers, English administrative records, and the transcripts of her trial itself, one of the most thoroughly documented legal proceedings of the medieval period. Her subsequent rehabilitation trial in 1456, ordered by the French crown to formally overturn her conviction, produced still further documentation, including testimony from those who had known her personally, making Joan one of the best documented figures of the entire 15th century in terms of the broad strokes of her life and death. And yet the physical remains of that life, the objects that passed through her hands or touched her body, have almost entirely vanished, leaving historians and relic hunters chasing fragments for nearly 6 centuries. Begin with what happened at the execution itself. English authorities, acutely aware of Joan's growing symbolic power among the French population, and wary of her body becoming an object of veneration or a rallying point for French resistance, took deliberate measures to prevent any physical relic from surviving her death. Contemporary accounts describe her body being burned not once, but multiple times, with officials reportedly raking back the coals to expose her charred remains to onlookers, confirming her death before burning the body a second and third time, specifically to reduce it to ash and prevent any bone fragments or physical remnant from being preserved by sympathizers. The remaining ashes, according to these same accounts, were then collected and thrown into the Seine River. A final, deliberate act meant to ensure nothing of her physical body could ever be recovered or venerated. This should have been the end of the physical record entirely. And for the woman's actual remains, it likely was, but this hasn't stopped nearly 6 centuries of claims, some sincere, some fraudulent, regarding objects supposedly connected to her. The most well-documented case of relic fraud connected to Joan involves a supposed rib bone and other fragments held for years by the Archdiocese of Tours, purportedly recovered from the site of her execution and venerated for decades as genuine remains. In 2006, a team of French scientists, forensic specialists, and historians subjected these fragments to rigorous chemical and forensic analysis, examining the bone and associated material under controlled laboratory conditions. Their conclusion, published in 2007, was unambiguous. The fragments were not human remains at all, but rather the remnants of an Egyptian mummy, likely a cat, dating from a period at least 1,000 years removed from Joan's actual death, and probably acquired centuries after 1431 from the antiquities trade that supplied European collectors and pharmacies with mummified materials for a variety of purposes, including as a purported medicinal ingredient. This particular relic, in other words, has been definitively and scientifically disproven, closing one thread of the broader mystery with unusual finality. But the disapproval of one fraudulent relic doesn't resolve the larger set of questions surrounding what else may have existed and simply never survived, or survived without ever being properly identified. Joan carried, by multiple contemporary accounts, a sword she claimed to have located, at the direction of what she described as divine voices, buried behind the altar of the Church of St. Catherine de Fierbois, an ancient blade that chroniclers described as bearing 5 crosses on its blade, and which she carried through much of her military campaign before it was reportedly broken, according to some accounts, during a skirmish near Paris. No sword matching this description and verified provenance has ever been definitively located, and several swords held in various French collections have been proposed as candidates over the centuries, none conclusively authenticated. Her personal banner, a white silk standard bearing an image of Christ and the words Jesus Maria, which Joan herself stated she valued more than her sword, is documented as having been present at her side throughout her campaigns, but its ultimate fate after her capture and execution is entirely unrecorded in any surviving source. Another object that simply stops appearing in the historical record at the moment of her capture, with no documented account of what became of it afterward. Beyond these specific objects, the broader category of Joan of Arc, relics, rings, letters, garments, and other personal items claimed by various churches, private collectors, and museums across France over the centuries, remains a genuinely contested field, where sincere historical claims, honest mistakes, and deliberate fraud have accumulated together in roughly equal measure, and where modern forensic and historical analysis, as demonstrated by the 2006 bone fragment investigation, has only occasionally been applied with the rigor needed to separate genuine artifact from wishful attribution or outright fabrication. What remains, nearly 6 centuries after that fire in Rouen marketplace, is one of history's most exhaustively documented lives paired with one of its most thoroughly erased physical records. A deliberate act of destruction carried out with unusual care by men who understood precisely what power a martyr's remains could hold, followed by centuries of competing claims attempting, not always honestly, to fill the void that destruction left behind. Whether any genuine fragment connected to Joan herself survived that river in 1431, scattered somewhere among sediment and centuries of subsequent silt, or whether the English achieved exactly what they set out to do, remains, like so much of what we've traced so far tonight, a silence history has never quite managed to fill. Consider, for a moment, how rare true secrecy actually is in history. Kings die, and physicians write down the cause. Treaties are signed, and copies are filed in a dozen archives. Even murder, as we've seen tonight, tends to leave behind an inquest, a rumor, a name someone eventually whispers to a chronicler. Secrecy, this complete, sustained for over 3 decades, surviving the deaths of everyone who knew the truth. That isn't the ordinary texture of the past. That takes deliberate, sustained effort, which is precisely what makes the case we're about to examine again in fuller detail worth sitting with a while longer. The historical record confirms this much without dispute. Beginning in 1669 and continuing until his death in 1703, a prisoner of unknown identity was held in a succession of French fortresses under the custody of a single jailer, Benign d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars, whose own career rose in near-perfect lockstep with this one prisoner's captivity, as though the 2 men's fates had been bound together by design. The prisoner moved first to the fortress at Pignerol in the Alps, then to Exilles, then to the island fortress of Ile Sainte-Marguerite off the coast of Caen, and finally, in 1698, to the Bastille itself in the heart of Paris, where he died on the evening of November 19, 1703. He was buried the following day under the name Marchioli, a name appearing nowhere else in any surviving French record, court document, or family lineage connected to his actual identity, as though invented specifically for the occasion of his burial and nothing else. Throughout this long captivity, the prisoner's face was documented as concealed, though the popular image of an iron mask, so central to how this story has come down to us, appears to be at least partly a later literary embellishment. Surviving correspondence from the period, including letters written by Saint-Mars himself to his superiors, more consistently describe a mask made of black velvet, fastened in a manner that allowed the prisoner to eat and sleep while obscuring his features from anyone who might glimpse him. It was Voltaire, writing decades later in the 18th century, who first popularized the far more dramatic image of iron, and the phrase stuck so completely that it has now become inseparable from the story itself, regardless of what material the actual mask was made from. What we can establish with real confidence, drawn directly from Saint-Mars' own surviving correspondence with the royal court, is the extraordinary, almost obsessive level of security surrounding this one prisoner, disproportionate to nearly any other captive documented anywhere in the French penal system of the period. Letters exchanged between Saint-Mars and the Marquis de Louvois, France's Secretary of State for War, describe explicit and repeated instructions. The prisoner was to speak to no one but his jailer. Any attempt to communicate with a guard, a fellow prisoner, or anyone at all was to be met with immediate and severe consequence. His face was to remain covered whenever any other person, even in passing, might catch sight of him, including during the carefully arranged transfers between fortresses, journeys conducted with a level of secrecy usually reserved for matters of state rather than the movement of a single prisoner. even death didn't relax this vigilance. Following his passing, his cell was reportedly stripped and scoured, its walls inspected, its furniture and some accounts destroyed outright, apparently to ensure no scratched message, no hidden note, no clue of any kind had been left behind for a future occupant or curious guard to discover. His clothing and few personal possessions were burned. Whatever this man knew, or whoever he was, someone with authority reaching to the very top of Louis XIV's government, determined that the truth needed to disappear as completely and permanently as the man himself. Such extraordinary, sustained secrecy, maintained consistently across 4 different fortresses and outlasting multiple shifts in the political administration overseeing French state prisons, strongly suggests the prisoner's true identity carried enormous political weight. Someone whose recognition, had it ever occurred, would have created a serious and lasting problem for the crown. But who, precisely, warranted treatment this extreme, and why has never been resolved through primary documentary proof, despite well over 3 centuries of dedicated historical investigation by researchers with access to increasingly complete archival material. The theory most deeply embedded in popular imagination, thanks largely to Voltaire's writings and later cemented by Alexandre Dumas' fictionalized 1847 novel, holds that the prisoner was an identical twin brother of King Louis XIV himself, born in secret and hidden away specifically to prevent any future challenge to the king's singular claim to the throne. It's a theory with obvious dramatic appeal, and one that has shaped nearly every popular retelling since. But it holds little support among serious historians who point to a fairly decisive problem. No birth record, no court account, no ambassador's private correspondence from the period hints at any such secret royal sibling. An omission that becomes especially significant given how thoroughly French royal births were documented, witnessed, and recorded at the time, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of disputed legitimacy. More historically grounded candidates emerge from closer examination of prison records and the specific timing of the prisoner's initial incarceration at Pignerol in 1669. One frequently proposed candidate is Ercole Antonio Mattioli, an Italian diplomat who, according to surviving diplomatic correspondence, betrayed confidential negotiations between France and the Duchy of Mantua concerning a strategically valuable fortress along Italy's northern border, an act of betrayal that embarrassed Louis XIV's foreign policy considerably and prompted his forcible arrest and transport into French custody. Some historians find the dates align closely enough to make Mattioli a credible match, though others note that the sustained intensity of the masked prisoner's treatment seems to exceed what a single diplomatic embarrassment, however damaging, would typically warrant across more than 3 decades of continued, unyielding secrecy. Another persistently proposed candidate is a former valet named Eustache Dauger, whose name surfaces in Saint-Mars's correspondence from roughly the same period, associated with some unspecified but evidently serious matter that Louvois' letters describe in unusually cautious, deliberately indirect language, careful never to state outright what Dauger had done, witnessed, or knew that necessitated such extreme and sustained precaution. Some historians have proposed Dauger may have possessed damaging knowledge connected to the affair of the poisons, a major scandal involving alleged poisoning plots, black magic accusations, and court intrigue that rocked the highest levels of Louis XIV's court during the 1670s, implicating, according to some testimony extracted under torture, individuals close to the king himself. The connection between Dauger and this scandal remains circumstantial, built from timing and cautious phrasing rather than direct documentary proof, but it has proven durable among researchers precisely because it would explain the government's apparent terror of exposure. Still, other researchers have proposed a connection to Nicolas Fouquet, Louis XIV's once powerful finance minister, whose own dramatic and sudden fall from royal favor in 1661 led to his imprisonment at Pinerol, a captivity that overlapped chronologically with the masked prisoner's earliest recorded years there. Fouquet's downfall remains, on its own, one of the more dramatic political reversals of Louis XIV's reign, and some historians have wondered whether the two cases, Fouquet's well-documented imprisonment and the masked prisoner's carefully hidden one, might be connected in ways the surviving fragmentary correspondence simply doesn't clarify. Perhaps through shared knowledge, shared conspirators, or some overlapping secret neither man was ever permitted to discuss. What ties every one of these competing theories together, and what continues to frustrate any definitive resolution even now, is the very feature that made the case remarkable in the first place. Someone with sufficient authority within Louis XIV's government determined that this prisoner's identity needed to remain unknown, not merely to the public of his own time, but seemingly to history itself, and organized his imprisonment with a thoroughness that has, by any reasonable measure, succeeded for over 300 years. Archivists and historians have pored over Saint-Mar's surviving letters line by line, searching for any inadvertent slip, any careless reference to a real name, any detail that might have escaped whatever careful editing process kept the truth contained for so long. The search has narrowed the field of plausible candidates considerably. It has not closed the case. Somewhere in the gap between Saint-Mar's deliberately vague, carefully worded correspondence and the ashes of whatever possessions were burned in that Bastille cell lies a name that someone in 17th century France was absolutely determined we would never learn. 3 centuries of dedicated searching across state archives, private family papers, and diplomatic correspondence scattered throughout Europe have not yet found it. Perhaps it survives still, misfiled in some provincial French archive, waiting for the right researcher to recognize what they're holding. Or perhaps, as its architects intended from the very beginning, it doesn't survive anywhere at all. From the sealed cell in the Bastille, cross now an ocean and a continent, back to the highlands of Peru, where a Mercedarian friar was compiling his own kind of forbidden document, not a hidden identity, but a history someone, it seems, badly wanted rewritten. The friar's name was Martín de Murua, a Basque-born missionary who arrived in Peru sometime in the 1580s and spent the following decades moving through Andean parishes, absorbing the oral histories, genealogies, and testimonies of Inca nobility still living in the generations immediately following Spanish conquest. What Murua produced from this work became one of the most significant surviving chronicles of Inca history and culture, a manuscript now known as the Historia General del Peru, completed in its most famous surviving version around 1616 and preserved today, richly illustrated, in the collection of the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. This much is documented and genuinely remarkable on its own terms. Murua's chronicle contains detailed accounts of Inca rulers, religious practices, administrative systems, and daily life drawn from indigenous informants who had, in some cases, direct memory or close second-hand knowledge of the empire before Spanish conquest shattered it in the 1530s. The Getty manuscript includes dozens of watercolor illustrations, believed to have been produced with the direct involvement of Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, an indigenous Andean writer and artist whose own separate, extraordinary chronicle would later surface as one of the most important, first-hand indigenous accounts of the colonial period to survive at all. The two men's work is now understood by scholars to be deeply intertwined, their manuscripts sharing illustrations, structural approaches, and source material in ways that took centuries to fully untangle. But here is where the documented history begins to fracture into genuine mystery. Murua is known, from his own writing and from later scholarly research, to have produced more than one version of his chronicle. An earlier manuscript, generally referred to as the Galvin manuscript, named for a later private owner, is believed to have been completed around 1590, predating the Getty version by roughly a quarter century. This earlier draft, itself the subject of considerable scholarly reconstruction efforts throughout the 20th century, appears to differ from the later Getty version in ways that go beyond simple editing or refinement, raising a harder question that has occupied Andean historians for decades. What precisely changed between Marua's earlier and later chronicles, and why? Some of the answer lies in well-documented historical circumstance. Colonial Peru in this period was governed under Viceroy Francisco de Toledo, whose administration pursued an aggressive, deliberate campaign to delegitimize the Inca imperial line, part of a broader policy justifying continued Spanish rule by portraying pre-conquest Inca governance as illegitimate, tyrannical, or itself the product of relatively recent conquest and usurpation rather than a long, stable dynastic tradition. Chroniclers writing under or shortly after Toledo's administration, including some whose work Marua is known to have drawn upon or been influenced by, produced histories notably shaped by this political agenda, and scholars have long debated how much of Marua's own narrative structure, particularly his treatment of specific Inca rulers' legitimacy and the sequencing of the royal lineage, reflects genuine indigenous testimony versus the colonial political pressures surrounding him as he wrote. This alone would make Marua's shifting chronicles a fascinating case study in how colonial politics shaped the historical record. But the mystery deepens further when you consider what physically happened to Marua's working materials, the notes, interviews, and draft sections that would have existed between his arrival in Peru and the completion of his two known surviving manuscripts. Historians examining the surviving Galvin and Getty manuscripts have identified textual evidence suggesting Marua drew on additional source material and possibly additional draft versions of his own chronicle that no longer survive in any known collection. Certain passages, genealogical details, and Quipu-derived information referenced or implied within the surviving texts don't have a clearly traceable origin within the material we currently possess, suggesting Marua's actual working archive, the full body of interviews and notes gathered across his decades in Peru, was considerably larger than what survives in either of his two known finished chronicles. What happened to this broader body of material? The honest, mainstream historical answer is that we simply don't know with certainty, and the most probable explanation likely involves the same ordinary attrition that claims most colonial-era documents: loss through fire, water damage, insect infestation, and the simple failure of any single institution to prioritize the careful preservation of a missionary's personal working papers across 4 centuries of subsequent history. Colonial Peru's archives suffered significant losses across this period through earthquakes, looting, and periods of administrative neglect. And there's no requirement to invoke anything more dramatic than ordinary historical entropy to explain why a friar's private notes, as opposed to his finished, presentable manuscripts, might not have survived. But a more pointed question persists among some Andean historians, one that circles back to Marua's own documented entanglement with colonial authority. Marua faced formal ecclesiastical investigation during his time in Peru, accused by members of his own religious order of mistreating indigenous parishioners under his authority, accusations serious enough to prompt a formal inquiry that temporarily disrupted his work and reputation. Given this documented friction with both religious and possibly civil authorities, some researchers have wondered whether portions of his original source material, particularly any content that might have preserved indigenous testimony in tension with the official Toledan narrative of Inca illegitimacy, could have been deliberately excluded, suppressed, or destroyed, either by Marua himself under institutional pressure or by others reviewing his work before its wider circulation. This remains speculative territory, without the kind of direct documentary proof that would elevate it from plausible theory to established fact. But the underlying tension it points to is real and well documented. Colonial chroniclers writing about Inca history operated within a political environment where certain conclusions, particularly regarding the legitimacy of Inca rule prior to Spanish conquest, carried genuine consequences for how colonial governance itself was justified. Whether Marua's missing material was lost to circumstance or shaped by pressure, the practical effect on the historical record is much the same. A gap between what an unusually well-positioned chronicler likely gathered from indigenous informants in the late 16th century, and what actually survives for modern historians to study. Adding a further layer of complexity, the Guaman-Poma connection raises its own unresolved questions. Guaman-Poma's own monumental chronicle, the Nueva Crónica y Buen Gobierno, completed around 1615 and rediscovered in a Danish royal library only in 1908, presents an account of Inca and colonial history considerably more critical of Spanish rule than Marua's surviving work. Despite the clear evidence that the two men collaborated, shared illustrators, and drew on overlapping source material. Reconciling these two accounts, one seemingly more accommodating of colonial authority, the other far more openly critical of it, has required extensive scholarly work over the past century. And some historians have proposed that the differences between them may reflect not just differing perspectives, but the specific editorial pressures and interventions that shaped what ultimately survived from each man's original, more extensive body of work. What remains, in the end, is a chronicle whose surviving versions are themselves the product of visible revision, produced by a man whose own standing with colonial authority was, at points, genuinely precarious, working in a period when the political stakes of how Inca history was told were considerably higher than simple scholarly accuracy. The Getty manuscript and the Galvin manuscript both survive, richly detailed, beautifully illustrated, and studied extensively by generations of Andean historians. But the fuller archive that likely stood behind them, the raw interviews, the draft passages, the testimony that didn't make it into either finished version, remains as absent from the historical record as the quipu strings themselves, those knotted cords that once encoded so much of Inca administrative and historical memory, and that no scholar today can fully read. Perhaps, in some overlooked colonial archive in Lima, Madrid, or a Peruvian provincial collection not yet fully catalogued, fragments of Marua's earlier working papers still exist, waiting for the right researcher to recognize their significance. Or perhaps, like so much of what colonial power touched and reshaped, they were never meant to survive at all, and what we're left with is only the version someone, centuries ago, decided the world should be permitted to read, 6 decades before English colonists would carve a single word into a post at Roanoke. A much larger and far less remembered expedition attempted the very same thing along this same eastern coastline, and left behind a silence even more complete. In the summer of 1526, a Spanish judge and explorer named Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón set out from Hispaniola with a fleet of 6 ships carrying somewhere between 500 and 600 colonists, along with African enslaved laborers, Dominican friars, livestock, and provisions, aiming to establish a permanent Spanish settlement somewhere along the southeastern coast of what is now the United States, decades before any other European power would attempt anything comparable in the region. Ayllón held a royal charter from the Spanish crown authorizing exactly this kind of colonization effort, and his expedition represents, by most historical accounts, the first documented attempt by Europeans to establish a permanent settlement within the present-day boundaries of the continental United States, predating the more famous Roanoke colony by nearly 60 years and Jamestown by more than 80. The expedition's exact landing location remains, itself, a matter of ongoing scholarly debate, with historians proposing sites ranging along the coast from present-day South Carolina down into Georgia, based on fragmentary surviving accounts and later attempts at geographic reconstruction. Wherever precisely they came ashore, the colonists named their settlement San Miguel de Gualdape, and what followed, according to the surviving Spanish chronicles, was catastrophe compounding catastrophe with almost unbearable speed. Disease broke out almost immediately, weakening the colonists within weeks of landing. Elon himself died on October 18, 1526, only months after the settlement's founding, from illness contracted during the venture, removing the expedition's central authority at precisely the moment the fragile colony needed steady leadership most. In the leadership vacuum that followed, internal conflict erupted among the remaining Spanish colonists, described in surviving accounts as factional infighting over succession and authority, further destabilizing a settlement already weakened by sickness, food shortages, and, according to some accounts, deteriorating relations with the surrounding indigenous population. It's here, in the specific details of the settlement's final collapse, that the historical record becomes genuinely troubled, both in the sense of being incomplete and in the sense of describing something rarely documented so early in the European colonization of North America. Several surviving Spanish accounts, including one written decades later by the chronicler Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, describe what historians now regard as the first recorded slave rebellion within the present-day United States, an uprising among the African enslaved people brought on the expedition, who reportedly rose up amid the chaos following Elon's death and the colony's rapid disintegration. The specific details of this uprising, including its scale, its immediate causes, and its ultimate resolution, are described only sparsely and inconsistently across the handful of surviving Spanish sources, none of which were written by participants in the rebellion itself, leaving modern historians to reconstruct the event almost entirely from the perspective of the colonizers, with the perspective, motivations, and fate of the enslaved rebels themselves almost entirely absent from the documentary record. By the time the surviving Spanish colonists abandoned the settlement, likely in late 1526 or very early 1527, reports suggest that of the original 500 to 600 people who had set out from Hispaniola, only a small fraction survived to return, some accounts placing the number as low as 150, decimated by disease, starvation, internal conflict, and whatever additional violence accompanied the settlement's final collapse. San Miguel de Gualdape was abandoned entirely within roughly a year of its founding, its exact location lost to time so thoroughly that modern archaeologists and historians still cannot agree on precisely where along hundreds of miles of coastline it once stood. This is where mainstream historical understanding largely rests, a colonization attempt undone by a fairly familiar combination of disease, poor timing, inadequate provisions, and leadership collapse, common enough hazards that doomed numerous early European colonial ventures across the Americas in this period. Elon's expedition, in this reading, simply arrived too early, too poorly prepared, and too far from adequate resupply to survive the combination of environmental and logistical challenges it faced, a pattern that would repeat itself, with variations, across numerous failed early colonial efforts throughout the 16th century. But several specific gaps in the record continue to draw scholarly attention precisely because they resist easy resolution within this straightforward narrative of ordinary colonial failure. What became of the enslaved Africans who reportedly rebelled amid the colony's collapse? Surviving Spanish accounts suggest at least some may have fled into the surrounding wilderness rather than returning to Hispaniola with the remaining Spanish colonists, potentially making contact with, or being absorbed into, indigenous communities in the region, though no definitive documentary trail confirms what became of them afterward. If accurate, this would represent one of the earliest instances of African and indigenous American contact and potential coexistence documented anywhere in what would become the United States. A genuinely significant historical thread that the surviving fragmentary sources simply don't allow us to follow to any confirmed conclusion. The exact location of the settlement itself remains a live archaeological question. Various researchers and historians over the past century have proposed sites near the Sapelo Sound in Georgia, along the Winyah Bay area of South Carolina, and several other points along the southeastern coastline, each argument drawing on careful reinterpretation of the sparse surviving Spanish geographic descriptions, none producing conclusive physical evidence in the form of confirmed period artifacts or structural remains that would definitively settle the debate. Unlike Roanoke, whose approximate location has long been established even as the fate of its colonists remains contested, San Miguel de Gualdape presents historians with something closer to the reverse problem. We know with reasonable confidence what happened to the colony in broad strokes: disease, leadership collapse, rebellion, and abandonment. But we don't know with any confidence exactly where any of it took place, leaving the physical site itself and whatever archaeological evidence it might still hold essentially lost. Some researchers have speculated further, wondering whether additional colonists beyond the enslaved Africans mentioned in surviving accounts might have remained behind rather than departing with the main body of survivors, whether through choice, incapacity, or separation during the settlement's chaotic final collapse, potentially integrating into local indigenous communities in ways the Spanish chronicles, written from a distance and after the fact, simply never captured. This remains speculative, grounded more in the pattern of what we know happened at other early colonial failures than in any direct evidence specific to Gualdape itself. But the underlying question of who exactly walked away from that failed settlement and where they ultimately went remains as open as the question of the settlement's physical location. What San Miguel de Gualdape leaves us with, ultimately, is a colonial failure documented just well enough to establish that something remarkable and troubling happened along this coastline 60 years before Roanoke, and not nearly well enough to answer the harder questions that failure raises about the fate of the people, both free and enslaved, who lived through its final collapse, and about the patch of American coastline that still, 5 centuries later, has never definitively given up the exact ground where it once stood. That patch of unmarked coastline, still withholding its exact location after 5 centuries, makes for an uneasy resting point. But not every trace of early colonial catastrophe stayed buried on land. Some of it went down at sea, in cargo holds packed with gold that never reached the king it was promised to. By 1522, the conquest of the Aztec Empire was, in the broadest sense, complete. Tenochtitlan had fallen the previous year, and Hernán Cortés, eager to secure royal favor and formal recognition of his conquest from Emperor Charles V, dispatched a shipment of treasure across the Atlantic intended to demonstrate, in the most tangible terms available, the extraordinary wealth of the territories he had claimed for the Spanish crown. This was not a single legendary vessel operating in isolation, but part of an established, if still young, pattern of transatlantic shipments carrying looted and tribute gold, silver, feathered ornaments, and other treasures back from New Spain, the first substantial wave of what would, over the following century, become the vast and highly organized Spanish treasure fleet system. Among the ships involved in this early 1522 shipment, Spanish and French sources of the period describe a vessel whose cargo included some of the most significant items to leave Mexico following the conquest: gold objects, ornamental featherwork, and precious stones drawn from the accumulated wealth of the fallen Aztec state, along with detailed correspondence and reports intended to inform the Spanish court of exactly what had been won. Popular historical retellings have sometimes attached the name the White Ship to this shipment, a designation that appears more prominently in later narrative accounts than in the sparse surviving primary Spanish shipping records themselves, which more typically identify vessels of the period by captain's name or registered ship name, rather than by the kind of evocative title that tends to accumulate around a story the longer it's retold. Whatever its precise contemporary designation, the vessel and its companion ships carried a cargo significant enough that its fate would ripple through European diplomacy for years afterward. That fate did not involve a storm or a reef or any of the natural hazards that claimed the Flor de la Mar off Sumatra a decade earlier. It involved a French corsair named Jean Fleury, sailing under commission from the shipowner Jean Angot, and, by extension, operating with the tacit support of King Francis I of France, whose kingdom remained locked in ongoing rivalry with Charles V's Spain across multiple fronts: diplomatic, territorial, and increasingly, as this episode demonstrates, maritime. In the waters near the Azores, a strategically vital waypoint for Spanish vessels crossing the Atlantic from the Caribbean, Fleury's ships intercepted the treasure convoy. The engagement is documented, with reasonable consistency, across both Spanish and French sources from the period, though the two traditions naturally emphasize different details, the Spanish accounts focusing on the scale of the loss and the diplomatic outrage that followed, the French accounts treating the capture as a matter of legitimate wartime privateering against a rival crown's shipping. Several ships were captured outright, their cargo seized and redirected to France, where the sheer scale and unfamiliarity of the treasure, gold worked into forms no European goldsmith had ever produced. Elaborate feathered items entirely outside the European decorative tradition immediately became a sensation at the French court, and, more broadly, across educated European circles encountering tangible evidence of Aztec civilization for the first time. This capture is, in itself, thoroughly documented history, and its consequences were significant and traceable. The seized Aztec treasure is understood to have directly fueled French royal interest in transatlantic exploration and eventual colonization ambitions, contributing to the political and financial momentum behind subsequent French voyages to North America. Some of the captured items are believed to have entered French royal and noble collections, examined and described in fragmentary form by contemporary chroniclers intrigued by objects so unlike anything produced within European artistic tradition. Charles V's government lodged formal protests over the capture, treating it as an act of piracy rather than legitimate warfare, a diplomatic dispute that added further friction to an already strained Franco-Spanish relationship during this period of near-constant rivalry between the two crowns. And yet, for an event significant enough to shape diplomatic tension and fund future exploration ambitions, the ultimate physical fate of most of the captured treasure itself becomes considerably harder to trace with precision once it reached French hands. Unlike the meticulous, if imperfect, Spanish record-keeping tradition surrounding treasure fleet cargo manifests, the redistribution of captured goods among French privateers, their financial backers, and the royal court followed a considerably less centralized and less thoroughly documented process. Some items are referenced in later French inventories and correspondence. Others simply stop appearing in any traceable written record after their initial capture, and the flurry of contemporary interest that followed, presumably melted down for their metal value, given as gifts, sold to collectors whose own records haven't survived, or otherwise absorbed into the general current of 16th century European wealth in ways that make individual pieces essentially impossible to trace today. This pattern, a well-documented capture followed by a comparatively poorly documented dispersal, raises questions that have interested both historians of the conquest and, more recently, Scholars specifically focused on the fate of pre-Columbian artistic and cultural objects following European contact. How many genuinely significant Aztec artifacts, items that might today be considered irreplaceable evidence of a civilization whose material culture was overwhelmingly destroyed or lost during and after the conquest, passed briefly through documented European hands in the 1520s before vanishing into private collections, melting pots, or simple neglect, their significance unrecognized by owners who saw only exotic curiosities rather than the surviving fragments of an empire's artistic tradition. Some researchers have proposed that a portion of the featherwork and goldwork captured in this and similar early shipments may still exist today, misattributed or entirely uncatalogued within European museum or private collections that inherited pieces from 16th century noble estates without full documentation of their original provenance. This isn't a claim requiring any particularly speculative leap, given the well-documented pattern of exactly this kind of provenance loss affecting numerous categories of historical artifacts across the centuries. But it remains, in the specific case of the 1522 capture, largely unproven, a plausible hypothesis rather than an established finding, since confirming any specific surviving object's connection to this particular shipment would require documentation that, as far as current scholarship has established, simply doesn't survive in sufficient detail. There is also the broader, harder-edged question underlying this entire episode, one that connects it back to the pattern we've now traced across multiple conquest-era treasures tonight. How much of what was taken from Tenochtitlan, from Cajamarca, from Malacca, and from countless smaller, less famous conquests across this same expansive period of European overseas expansion, survived at all in any form future generations could study, versus how much was melted, scattered, or lost in transit, leaving historians and art historians alike working from written descriptions of objects that no longer physically exist anywhere for direct examination. The Fleury capture is unusual only in how well documented its initial moment of loss happens to be. Its aftermath, the slow scattering of the actual physical objects across French hands and beyond, resembles the far murkier fate of nearly every other treasure we've followed across this exploration. What remains certain is this: gold and featherwork taken from a fallen empire, loaded aboard ships bound for a Spanish king who never received them, seized instead by a French corsair whose actions reshaped European rivalry and curiosity about the Americas for years afterward, and then, having made their brief, sensational appearance in the documented historical record, largely disappearing again into the same kind of silence that has swallowed nearly every treasure this exploration has traced. Somewhere among Europe's uncatalogued inheritances, in a provincial collection or a museum storeroom holding pieces whose 16th century origins were never fully recorded, fragments of that capture may yet remain, waiting like so much of what we've followed tonight, for someone to recognize exactly what they're looking at. The bell tolls once, twice, and then falls silent. An alarm bell in the small town of Uglish, ringing out on May 15, 1591, over a courtyard where a 9-year-old boy has just been found with his throat cut, a knife-like toy still clutched, according to the official inquiry, in his own small hand. The boy was Dmitry Ivanovich, youngest son of Ivan IV, the Tsar history remembers as Ivan the Terrible, and his death in that Uglitch courtyard would open a mystery that eventually helped plunge Russia into one of the most catastrophic periods of its history. A 15-year span so defined by chaos, false claimants, and unresolved succession that Russians still call it simply the Smuta, the time of troubles. To understand why one child's death carried such enormous weight, you have to understand the collapse that preceded it. Ivan, whose reign transformed Muscovy into a centralized, expansive state, through both genuine administrative achievement and periods of extraordinary, well-documented brutality, had by the end of his life destroyed much of his own succession through his own hand, quite literally. In 1581, during a documented fit of rage, Ivan struck his eldest son and heir, also named Ivan, with his iron-tipped staff, a blow that proved fatal days later. An event corroborated by multiple contemporary accounts and later forensic examination of the elder Ivan's remains, which revealed elevated mercury levels alongside skull trauma, consistent with historical descriptions of the incident. This left the Tsar's surviving sons as Fyodor, intellectually limited and widely regarded by contemporaries as unsuited to effective rule, and the much younger Dmitri, born to Ivan's seventh wife, a marriage whose canonical legitimacy under Orthodox Church law was itself questioned, since the Church recognized only 3 marriages as valid, casting a shadow over young Dmitri's own legitimacy as a potential heir even before his death raised far larger questions. When Ivan IV died in 1584, Fyodor ascended the throne, but effective governance fell increasingly to Boris Godunov, a boyar of considerable political skill who had married into the royal family and steadily consolidated power around the weak new Tsar. Young Dmitri, meanwhile, was sent to Uglish along with his mother, technically in a form of internal exile common for royal relatives who represented, by their mere existence, a potential future challenge to the ruling line. 7 years later, Dmitri was dead, and the official government inquiry, conducted under Godunov's direct authority, concluded the boy had died accidentally, that he suffered from epilepsy, and that during a seizure he had fallen upon a knife he was playing with, a plausible if grimly specific explanation for a documented childhood accident. The investigation was led by Prince Vasily Shwisky, whose own later political career would place him in direct, complicated relationship to the very succession crisis Dmitri's death helped trigger, a detail historians have long found difficult to view as entirely incidental. The people of Uglich did not accept the official explanation. Immediately following the boy's death, a mob formed, convinced Dmitri had been murdered on Godunov's orders to clear his own path toward the throne, and turned violently against several individuals accused, without formal trial, of carrying out the killing, lynching them in the immediate chaos following the discovery of the body. Godunov's government responded with severity, exiling numerous Uglich residents, including, notably, the belle that had rung the alarm that day, which was formally punished, flogged, and exiled to Siberia. A detail so strange it reads almost as folklore but is, in fact, documented in surviving Russian administrative records of the period, the bell itself surviving today. Eventually returned to Uglish centuries later, where it remains on display. When Fyodor died in 1598 without an heir, the male line of the ancient Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled Russian lands for over 7 centuries, came to its formal end. Boris Godunov, positioned perfectly by years of accumulated authority, was elected Tsar by a national assembly, becoming the first non-Rurikid ruler of Russia in centuries. And it was almost immediately into this fragile new reign that the mystery of Dmitri's death returned, transformed into something considerably more dangerous than an unresolved local tragedy. In 1604, a man appeared in Poland, Lithuania, claiming to be Dmitri himself, asserting he had survived the assassination attempt at Uglish, that a different child had been killed and substituted in his place by loyal servants, and that he had spent the intervening years in hiding, protected by those still faithful to the legitimate Rurikid line. This man, remembered by history as False Dmitri I, gathered substantial Polish and Lithuanian backing, along with growing support among Russians themselves, many of whom, whether from genuine belief or from simple exhaustion with Godunov's increasingly troubled reign, marked by famine, unrest, and economic crisis, proved willing to accept his claim. He marched into Russia, and following Godunov's sudden death in 1605, actually succeeded in taking the throne, ruling briefly as Tsar before being overthrown and killed in a Moscow uprising in 1606, led, in one of history's more pointed ironies, by the very same Vasily Shuisky who had originally investigated and officially confirmed young Dmitri's death at Uglitch 15 years earlier. This should have settled the matter definitively. It did not. A second pretender, now remembered as False Dmitri II, emerged within the following year, gathering his own substantial following and establishing a rival court that, for a period, controlled significant Russian territory in direct competition with Shuisky's own contested reign, before being assassinated in 1610. A third, considerably less successful claimant, False Dmitri III, appeared even later in the Troubles, gathering minor support before his own downfall. The sheer persistence of these claims, across multiple separate individuals and years of sustained political chaos, speaks to something genuinely unresolved sitting at the heart of Russian political consciousness during this period, an uncertainty about the true fate of the last Rurikid heir substantial enough to fuel repeated, large-scale political movements built entirely around contesting the official 1591 verdict. What do modern historians make of this? The mainstream scholarly position, drawing on the surviving inquiry documentation, physical evidence, and the broader medical plausibility of the original account, tends to support the conclusion that Dmitri did in fact die accidentally at Uglitch, that childhood epilepsy combined with a seizure while holding a bladed toy represents a genuinely plausible, if tragic, accidental death, and that the pretenders who followed were opportunistic claimants exploiting popular distrust of Godunov rather than evidence of any genuine substitution or survival. This reading treats the time of Troubles less as a mystery about what actually happened to one child, and more as a demonstration of how a politically convenient uncertainty, once created, can be repeatedly weaponized by ambitious claimants regardless of its underlying truth. But the case for lingering doubt hasn't fully disappeared from serious historical discussion either. The investigation into Dmitri's death was conducted under the direct authority of the man who stood to benefit most from the boy's permanent removal as a future rival claimant, a conflict of interest serious enough that even historians who accept the accidental death conclusion generally acknowledge the original 1591 inquiry cannot be treated as an entirely disinterested, objective process. Dmitri's remains were later formally examined and canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church in 1606, following his elevation to sainthood as a holy martyr, an examination that church authorities of the period declared confirmed his identity and the nature of his death, though the standards and methods of a 17th century religious canonization inquiry obviously don't meet modern forensic evidentiary standards, leaving even this later confirmation open to some degree of historical skepticism. What remains, centuries later, is a small tomb within the Archangel Cathedral in the Moscow Kremlin, where Dmitri's remains were formally transferred and enshrined following his canonization, a resting place that stands, in its own quiet way, as the Russian state's final official answer to a question that nonetheless fueled 15 years of pretenders, civil war, and foreign intervention before Russia's political order finally stabilized under a new dynasty in 1613. Whether the boy resting within that tomb died by accident, by murder, or whether the boy within it is even Dmitri at all, given the repeated, sustained claims of substitution that shaped an entire era of Russian history, remains a question the official record closed definitively in 1591, and that the following 15 years of Russian history suggest an enormous number of people, at the time, were simply unwilling to accept. An official verdict, closed on paper but never fully accepted in practice. We just watched that pattern play out across 15 years of Russian upheaval. Now, watch it play out in a single library reading room. where a supposedly settled question about a small piece of parchment has refused to stay settled for over 60 years. The object in question resides today at Yale University's Bybliotheca Rare, Book and Manuscript Library, the very same institution housing the Voynich manuscript we examined earlier in this exploration. It is a map, roughly 27.8 by 40 centimeters, drawn in ink on parchment, depicting the known world as understood by a medieval European cartographer. Europe, Africa, and Asia rendered in recognizable, if somewhat archaic, form. And then, positioned in the northwestern Atlantic, unmistakably present, a landmass labeled Vinlanda Insula, Vinland Island, connected by inscription to a documented Norse expedition led by Bjarni and Leif, an apparent reference to the historical Norse voyages to North America recorded separately in the Icelandic sagas. If genuine, this single sheet of parchment would represent something extraordinary. A European cartographic document predating Columbus's 1492 voyage, explicitly depicting North American land, evidence that knowledge of Norse contact with the Americas had circulated within European intellectual and ecclesiastical circles centuries before Columbus ever set sail, rather than remaining confined to Scandinavia and Iceland's own saga tradition. The map surfaced publicly in 1965, when Yale University Press published it alongside considerable scholarly fanfare, accompanied by a companion volume situating the map within a bound compilation that also included a genuine medieval text known as the Tartar Relation, an account of a 13th century papal mission to the Mongol court. The map's presentation to the public was deliberately timed, released just before Columbus Day, a scheduling choice that drew immediate attention and immediate controversy, given the map's implicit challenge to Columbus's traditional status as the European discoverer of the Americas. From the very beginning, the map's authenticity faced serious scholarly skepticism, running on parallel tracks with the institutional confidence Yale itself projected in its publication. The parchment itself was radiocarbon dated in 2002 to approximately 1434, a date consistent with genuine 15th century origin and, notably, close to the same period the Bibliotheca Corviniana was being assembled in Buda, though radiocarbon dating establishes only the age of the parchment material, not necessarily the date the ink was actually applied to it, a distinction that would prove absolutely central to the controversy that followed. Because it's the ink, not the parchment, where the mystery has concentrated most intensely across 6 decades of forensic and chemical analysis. In 1974, a chemical analysis conducted by Walter McCrone, a respected microanalyst, identified anatase, a specific crystalline form of titanium dioxide, within the map's ink. This finding proved significant because anatase in this particular synthetic crystalline form wasn't commercially produced or available until the 20th century, a detail that, if accurate, would seem to close the question of authenticity definitively in favor of forgery, since no genuine medieval ink could plausibly contain a compound that simply didn't exist in that form until roughly 500 years after the map's supposed creation. This should have settled the matter. It didn't. Subsequent researchers, using different analytical techniques and instruments across the following decades, produced results that complicated McCrone's findings rather than simply confirming them. Some later analyses detected anatase in smaller quantities, or questioned whether McCrone's sampling and measurement techniques had been fully reliable given the instrumentation available in the 1970s. Other researchers proposed that natural anatase, occurring in mineral form rather than synthetic industrial production, could theoretically have been present in period-appropriate inks through natural mineral sources, though this counter-argument itself faced considerable scholarly pushback regarding whether naturally occurring anatase would present in the specific crystalline structure McCrone had originally identified. The back and forth continued for decades, a genuine scientific dispute playing out across multiple research teams, publications, and analytical methodologies, each new study seemingly poised to resolve the question definitively, and each new study instead becoming another data point in an increasingly complex, unresolved debate. Yale itself shifted its own institutional position multiple times across this period, at points expressing renewed confidence in the map's authenticity following favorable analyses, and at other points acknowledging the mounting evidence suggesting forgery. Then, in 2021, Yale released the results of a new, comprehensive analysis using advanced X-ray fluorescence spectrometry, techniques considerably more precise than what had been available to McCrone or subsequent researchers in earlier decades. This analysis concluded that the map's ink did indeed contain significant quantities of titanium in a form consistent with 20th century synthetic production, and Yale's own library formally stated that the evidence now supported the conclusion that the Vinland map was a modern forgery, likely produced sometime in the 20th century before its public emergence in the 1960s. This represents, as of the most recent major analysis, the closest thing to an official, institutional resolution this particular mystery has received. And yet, precisely because the map's authenticity had been debated in good faith by serious researchers for nearly 60 years, before this determination, with genuine scientific uncertainty at multiple points along the way, several harder questions remained considerably less settled than the forgery conclusion itself might suggest. Who, precisely, created the map and when? If it is indeed a 20th century forgery, it represents a work of extraordinary sophistication, correctly replicating period-appropriate Latin inscriptions, historically plausible geographic knowledge drawn from genuine medieval source material, and a physical parchment base that itself dates authentically to the correct historical period, suggesting the forger either possessed access to genuine period parchment, perhaps recovered from a damaged or incomplete medieval document, or otherwise sourced material with remarkable historical precision. This level of sophistication has led some researchers to propose the forgery, if that's indeed what it is, required not merely artistic skill, but genuine, specialized scholarly knowledge of medieval cartography, Latin paleography, and Norse historical sources, narrowing the plausible pool of potential forgers considerably, without, so far, identifying a confirmed culprit. Several specific candidates have been proposed over the decades by researchers investigating the map's likely origin, including various scholars and dealers connected to the map's documented chain of custody before its 1965 publication, though no single candidate has been definitively confirmed through direct documentary evidence, leaving the question of authorship itself as unresolved as the authenticity question was for most of the map's public existence. There's also a subtler question that persists even accepting the forgery conclusion. How much of the map's actual content, setting aside the physical authenticity of the ink and parchment, might still reflect genuine historical knowledge, whether drawn from real, now lost medieval sources the forger had access to, or simply from careful, well-informed research into the genuine Norse sagas and existing medieval cartographic conventions. A skilled forgery, after all, doesn't necessarily invent its content from nothing, and untangling what portion of the map's information genuinely traces back to authentic medieval geographic knowledge versus what reflects a modern creator's own research and invention remains a considerably more complicated question than the binary of authentic versus forged might initially suggest. What remains in that climate-controlled Yale reading room is a small parchment map that spent nearly 60 years as one of the more contested objects in medieval studies, moving repeatedly between confirmed forgery and plausible authenticity as analytical technology advanced, before arriving, apparently, at a scientific conclusion in 2021 that even now hasn't fully closed every question the map first raised in 1965, whether the full story behind its creation, the identity of whoever made it, the sources they drew upon, and the reasons they chose this particular moment in history to fabricate, will ever be definitively established remains, itself, an open question resting quietly alongside the map's own long-contested ink. 2 decades before that Yale parchment's supposed 1434 dating, and roughly 1,000 miles southeast of any Norse voyage, a very different kind of medieval document was being drafted, sealed, and distributed among the courts of Central Europe. One whose surviving fragments still leave historians reconstructing an entire secret society from little more than scattered signatures and a handful of surviving badges. The Order of the Dragon, in Latin the Societas Draconistarum, was founded in 1408 by Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary and later Holy Roman Emperor, along with his wife Barbara of Chile. On its documented surface, the order functioned as a chivalric fraternity in the tradition of similar medieval institutions like England's Order of the Garter, bound by a founding charter, a set of statutes governing membership conduct, and a shared emblem, a dragon coiled into a circle, its tail wrapped around its own neck, worn as a badge or pendant by initiated members as a mark of their inclusion. The Order's founding purpose, as documented in the surviving charter, centered explicitly on defending Christian Europe against the advancing Ottoman Empire, whose steady territorial expansion through the Balkans represented, by the early 15th century, an increasingly urgent existential concern for the kingdoms and noble houses of Central and Eastern Europe. Membership was drawn from precisely the ranks of nobility positioned to matter most in this struggle: kings, princes, and powerful regional lords whose combined military and political resources Sigismund sought to formally bind together under a shared oath of mutual defense and coordinated resistance. Among the order's documented membership, drawn from surviving charter records and later historical research, was Vlad II of Wallachia, inducted around 1431, whose membership in the order is, in fact, the direct source of his own historical epithet, Vlad Dracul. Dracul, deriving from the Romanian rendering of dragon, referencing his membership badge and order affiliation. His son, born shortly after this induction, would carry the same association forward into his own name, Vlad III, remembered to history by the diminutive Dracula, son of the dragon, a lineage connection that later, through Bram Stoker's 19th century novel, would transform a genuine medieval chivalric order into an unlikely footnote within one of literature's most enduring Gothic legends, though the historical order of the dragon itself had nothing to do with vampirism or the supernatural elements later fiction would attach to its most famous member's descendant. This much rests on reasonably solid documentary ground, drawn from surviving charter fragments, contemporary correspondence referencing the order, and physical badges recovered through archaeological and antiquarian research over the following centuries. But here, the picture begins to thin considerably, because for an organization whose membership included some of the most powerful figures in 15th century Central European politics, remarkably little of the order's actual internal record survives. Its meeting proceedings, its full membership rolls across its decades of documented activity, its internal correspondence coordinating the military and political action its founding charter explicitly called for. What historians do know is that the order appears to have functioned with a genuine, if informal, structure beyond simple ceremonial membership. Surviving references suggest coordinated military activity among its members during several campaigns against Ottoman forces throughout the early to mid-15th century. and the order's symbolism and rhetoric appear in various diplomatic correspondence and chronicles referencing the broader Christian resistance effort across this period. But the order's own internal administrative record, the kind of detailed institutional archive that survives for comparable chivalric orders like the Garter or the Golden Fleece, whose founding statutes, membership rolls, and meeting records survive in considerably more complete form across the same general period, simply doesn't exist for the Order of the Dragon in anything approaching the same completeness. Why would one 15th century chivalric order leave behind such a comparatively thin documentary trail, while contemporaries founded under similar circumstances and serving similar political functions left considerably fuller archives? The most straightforward, mainstream historical explanation points to the order's specifically military and politically sensitive purpose, an organization coordinating active resistance against a genuinely dangerous external threat, operating across the politically fragmented and frequently unstable landscape of 15th century Central Europe, a region that experienced repeated warfare, succession crises, and territorial reorganization across the following century, any of which could plausibly account for the loss of internal administrative records that were never intended for wide circulation or long-term ceremonial preservation in the way that England's more stable and continuously operating Garter tradition maintained its own records. This explanation is reasonable, well-grounded in the broader documented instability of the region, and doesn't require invoking anything beyond ordinary historical attrition, war, administrative discontinuity, and the simple fact that a militarily active secret order, unlike a purely ceremonial one, may never have generated the kind of extensive paperwork that survives for other chivalric institutions in the first place. But the order's specifically secretive character, referenced in some surviving accounts describing initiation rites and internal oaths conducted with particular discretion, has left room for more speculative historical interest regarding what precisely its fuller internal records might have contained had they survived. Some historians researching the order have noted that its combination of high-level political membership, explicit military coordination purpose, and unusually thin surviving documentation creates exactly the kind of gap that invites speculation about deliberately guarded internal knowledge, military strategy, intelligence regarding Ottoman troop movements and political developments, or coordinated diplomatic planning among its noble membership that those involved may have had genuine reason to keep from wider circulation, given the order's function as a functioning resistance coalition rather than a purely ceremonial fraternity. Whether any of this hypothesized sensitive internal material ever existed in the kind of organized archival form that could meaningfully be called secret archives, as opposed to simply the ordinary, scattered correspondence any political military coalition of this period would have generated and then lost to time in the normal course of subsequent centuries, remains impossible to establish definitively given how little survives either way. The order itself appears to have declined gradually across the mid to late 15th century, its explicit anti-Ottoman purpose becoming less centrally organized as the political landscape shifted. Various member kingdoms pursued their own, sometimes conflicting strategies toward the Ottoman threat, and the coordinated fraternal structure Sigismund had established gradually dissolved without any single documented dissolution event, simply fading from active reference in the surviving record over subsequent decades. What remains today are scattered physical badges, recovered through archaeological finds and preserved in various European museum collections, a handful of surviving charter fragments and membership references, and the indirect famous legacy carried forward through the Dracul and Dracula naming tradition that would eventually eclipse, in popular memory, almost everything else about the order's actual historical function and membership. The order's own internal history, the fuller record of its meetings, its coordinated military planning, its complete membership across the decades of its documented activity, remains as fragmentary and thin as the parchment badges that survive it, scattered across archives and collections that have never been fully reconciled into a complete institutional history. Perhaps, in some regional Central European archive not yet fully catalogued, particularly given how many such archives across Hungary, Romania, and neighboring regions suffered disruption, relocation, and loss across subsequent centuries of war and political upheaval. Further fragments of the order's internal correspondence and administrative record still wait to be identified and connected to this same 15th century fraternity. Until then, the Order of the Dragon remains known to history largely through its symbol and its most infamous member's descendant, its own fuller internal workings, and whatever secrets those workings may have once contained, as elusive now as they apparently were even to some of the Order's own contemporaries. From the fractured archives of Central Europe, across the Atlantic once more, to a small, unassuming island off the southern shore of Nova Scotia, roughly 140 acres of forest and swamp that would, over the following 4 centuries, become the site of one of North America's most persistent and expensive treasure hunts, built on a foundation of legend considerably older and considerably murkier than most of its searchers have ever fully acknowledged. Oak Island itself entered the documented historical record of organized excavation in 1795, when, according to the story passed down through generations of local Nova Scotia families, a teenager named Daniel McGinnis discovered a depression in the ground beneath an old oak tree, bearing marks suggesting something had once been lowered into it, a discovery that launched what would become known as the Money Pit, an excavation site that has since consumed the effort, funding, and in several documented cases the lives of treasure hunters across more than 2 centuries of increasingly elaborate digging, flooding, and speculation. But this chapter isn't about the Money Pit itself, extensively covered elsewhere and still under active modern excavation even now. It's about what came before it, the layer of legend and circumstantial historical possibility that predates McGinnis's discovery by nearly 2 centuries, and that some researchers argue may explain not just why treasure hunters became convinced something valuable was buried on Oak Island in the first place, but who might have buried it there, decades or even centuries before any documented excavation began. The late 16th century placed this stretch of the North Atlantic coastline within a genuinely active, if sparsely documented, zone of European maritime activity. French, Basque, and English fishing and exploration vessels are known, through scattered historical and archaeological evidence, to have operated along the Nova Scotia coast throughout this period, decades before any formal, sustained European colonization of the region took hold. Privateering and outright piracy were similarly well-documented realities of Atlantic maritime life during this era, and the broader Nova Scotia and New England coastline has long carried a dense accumulation of local pirate and buried treasure folklore, some of it traceable to genuine documented privateer activity, much of it impossible to verify against any specific historical figure or event with real confidence. Where Oak Island's precursor legends become genuinely interesting, rather than simply another entry in a long regional tradition of vague buried treasure folklore, is in the more specific historical thread some researchers have attempted to connect to the island's later well-documented Money Pit discovery. Several theories, circulating in various forms since at least the 19th century, propose that the elaborate underground structure McGinnis and subsequent excavators encountered wasn't the work of 18th century treasure hunters or unlucky colonial settlers, but rather represents considerably older engineering, potentially dating back to exactly this late 16th century window of documented, if sparse, European maritime presence in the region. One frequently discussed theory connects Oak Island to Francis Bacon, and a broader claim that a group associated with him may have used the island as a repository for either genuine treasure or significant documents, including, in some of the more elaborate versions of this theory, manuscripts related to Bacon's own extensive writing and, in the theory's most speculative form, materials connected to authorship debates surrounding Shakespeare's plays, a claim that finds essentially no support among mainstream historians or Shakespeare scholars, but that has nonetheless persisted within Oak Island research circles for well over a century, sustained more by the romantic appeal of connecting two enduring historical mysteries than by any direct documentary evidence placing Bacon or his associates anywhere near Nova Scotia. A separate, and, to many researchers, somewhat more historically grounded theory involves Marie Antoinette and the French crown jewels, proposing that royalist sympathizers, in the chaotic final years before and during the French Revolution, smuggled significant crown treasure across the Atlantic for safekeeping, potentially depositing it on Oak Island through French colonial or maritime connections to the region. This theory, notably, sits chronologically much later than the late 16th century window this chapter specifically examines, illustrating something important about how Oak Island's accumulated legendary material spans several genuinely distinct historical periods: 16th century maritime activity, 17th and 18th century piracy, and 18th century revolutionary upheaval, often blended together in popular retellings in ways that obscure how little any of these specific historical threads can actually be connected to one another, or to the island itself through direct documentary evidence. The theory, drawing the most sustained scholarly and archaeological attention in recent years, connects Oak Island to the Knights Templar, and more specifically to the broader claim that Scottish or other European parties with Templar connections may have reached North America considerably earlier than Columbus, potentially as early as the 14th century under the Scottish nobleman Henry Sinclair, and that Oak Island's engineered structures reflect this earlier, otherwise undocumented presence. This theory has gained particular traction through its connection to Sinclair, whose own documented historical activities are genuine and well established within Scottish and Norwegian records of the period, even though his specific alleged voyage to North America rests on considerably thinner and more contested evidence, drawn primarily from a later, disputed historical account known as the Zeno narrative, whose own reliability and authenticity have themselves been extensively debated by historians independent of any Oak Island connection. What ties all of these competing precursor theories together, and what has sustained over 2 centuries of continued excavation and speculation despite the total absence, so far, of any definitively recovered treasure, is the genuinely unusual physical evidence the Money Pit site has produced across generations of investigation. Early excavators reported encountering layers of wood platforms at regular depth intervals, suggesting deliberate engineered construction rather than a naturally occurring geological feature. Later investigations identified what appeared to be a sophisticated flooding mechanism, seemingly designed to fill the pit with seawater whenever excavation reached a certain depth. A feature that, if genuinely deliberate rather than a natural consequence of the island's proximity to tidal water tables, would represent a remarkably sophisticated engineering effort for whoever originally constructed it, regardless of which historical period or group ultimately proves responsible. Modern geological and archaeological analysis has offered its own more measured counter-perspective to these dramatic historical theories, noting that Oak Island's underlying geology, its natural limestone formations and sinkholes, could plausibly account for some of the seemingly engineered features early excavators encountered, without requiring any deliberate human construction at all, let alone construction tied to Templars, French royalty, or Baconian conspirators. This more conservative geological explanation has gained increasing traction among professional archaeologists and geologists who have examined the site in recent decades, even as popular treasure hunting efforts, most visibly documented through ongoing television production, have continued pursuing the more dramatic historical theories with sustained, well-funded excavation efforts. What remains unresolved, after well over 2 centuries of digging, flooding, funding, and in several documented cases, loss of life during excavation attempts, is a genuinely open question sitting somewhere between remarkable geological coincidence and deliberate, sophisticated human engineering, potentially dating back considerably further than the Money Pit's formal 1795 discovery date, into exactly the sparse, poorly documented window of late 16th century Atlantic maritime activity this chapter has traced. Whether Oak Island's true origin lies in natural limestone formation, later colonial-era treasure burial, or something considerably older and more deliberate, reaching back to exactly the kind of shadowy, undocumented European presence that characterized this stretch of coastline in the decades before formal colonization began, remains, after everything modern excavation technology has been able to bring to bear on the site, still very much an open pit.